All right, it's 3. We got a long session, so let's see if we can get this going. First off, I'm going to have Ann call the roll, see if we've got a quorum.
Okay. Reed,
Here.
Dr. Cantu,
Here.
John Agather,
Here.
Anacua Garcia,
Here.
Councilwoman Villagran, Peter Anamfre, Andy Castillo, I don't think Andy's here, Al Rodriguez, Michael Kinnick, Anne Marie.
I think she's going to have to be in and out
Anne
today.
Marie.
Got it.
It's Anne Marie weighing in.
Thank you.
Okay.
Jack Hebden, Wayne Eddington.
Wayne's on the road. He's going to try to join later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tony Edwards,
Here.
Michael Sanchez, Didi Bamaris, Kurt Anastasia. See Kurt, Christopher Fullerton, Dr. Femi, Dana McGinnis. Got you, Dana. Jim Berg and Anita Ledbetter.
Hi, here.
Perfect. Yes, sir. We have a quorum.
Okay. Okay, there's the councilwoman's on.
Yep, I see her.
And who's on this call-in number? Is that Wayne?
Reed, that is Anne Marie.
Anne Marie. Okay.
Okay.
All right, good.
All right.
Just want to thank y'all very much. I appreciate the attendance and the prompt start here. Our first order of business is the invocation of Jose Reyes.
Thank you for the many blessings you've freely given to each of us. And we ask for your presence to guide this meeting of the Rate Advisory Committee. Provide them with the knowledge, compassion, and wise counsel needed as they discuss the business matters on the agenda today. Help us all to remember that we're stewards acting on behalf of our customers, and provide us with the grace to serve all people well. And we ask this in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Reyes. Our next order of business is public input. I know Alan is here. I don't know if there's others. Okay, just one?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's give him time to get up here. Up here.
Reed is.
Up.
There you go.
You can have this. That way we can all hear you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Alan Montemayor. I'm chairman of the Alamo Group of the Sierra Club. Lifelong resident of San Antonio. I love San Antonio. To the rising cost of natural gas and its impact on our energy bills here in San Antonio. In the first paragraph, they say, current natural gas prices are the highest in almost 15 years since November 2008. CPS Energy cannot control the natural gas market. That's a given. In the third paragraph, it says, even our ongoing work to lessen high prices is still not enough to protect our customers from rising natural gas costs. In particular, the reason that we do not want to see you choose the options of converting to natural gas is that you can't control the emissions from natural gas, from production, refining, and burning. The fugitive emissions of natural gas have horrible consequences for the environment, perhaps even as bad as the CO2 that would have come out of the coal plants. The jury is out on that. I know that you'll be evaluating that with a dispassionate eye. But in particular, for the citizens of San Antonio, I hope that you can look to the future and look to clean energy for San Antonio. I'm a realist. I understand that there is a limit to how much clean energy we can have in San Antonio until battery technology really comes into maturity. But regardless of that, please factor in not just the economics of this, but the health of the citizens of San Antonio and their ability to pay this bill that CPS Energy has obviously somewhat lost control of, with the natural gas prices. With the world as it is right now, we are entering a great deal of uncertainty associated with energy, and natural gas is going to go up and down, probably mostly up, given what's going on. And I urge you to push away from natural gas as you make your very difficult decisions. Thank you for your kind attention.
Alan, thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking your time to be here with us today. All right, let's just talk about a couple of things before we introduce our folks that we've gotten here from Burns and McDonnell. And if you can put on the slide and that the event planning, because I think it's important everybody gets a look forward on what's ahead of us so that we don't, any of us, get surprised with what we're going to be asked to do. We have given a challenge, and we've given pretty much, this is the way it is. December 12th, the board's going to meet and vote to give management a direction. At that time, I'm assuming that management will give them their opinion and they will get feedback. We will be voting, and I'll get back to that in a minute, on December 6th. Let's go to the top now. We're here on the 15th. We have a RAC meeting on the 20th where Charles River Associates will give us the results of the reference case. Okay? So think about it this way, you're going to get, it's a reference scenario. I got to use the right terminology. I apologize. So it's the reference scenario against 9 portfolios. And sometimes I'll slip and call those cases, but it's portfolios. And then we've got 3 sensitivities on STEP and potentially some sensitivities on a winter storm. It's my understanding that that's what we'll see on the 15th. We will then have 2 sessions on November 3rd. They're voluntary. You can come if you want. If you don't. You can be online. But this is going to be sessions with Burns and McDonnell, where we will be able to ask our questions about what our concerns are with the reference case. So we can focus on that. Then on November 17th, we're going to get all 9 all 9 portfolios for all 4 scenarios, market conditions. That's a lot of data. So we can't just go from November 17th to December 6th and vote. We're going to have an opportunity to meet with the folks again so they can help us if we have questions, right? So we're going to have 2 more sessions on December 2nd. December 6th, we'll try to get a decision, a guidance. If you go back to the bylaws, for us to actually, quote unquote, vote on, to recommend something, we have to have 60% of the rack, not 60% of the people that are there, agree on it. Now, that's like breaking a filibuster in Congress, okay? That's a big number. One of the ways we're proposing to do this, if it turns out that it's okay with the lawyers, given the bylaws, and the bylaws clearly state they would prefer us to negotiate an agreement for a recommendation as opposed to have a vote. One of the ways of doing that we're going to look at, and we'll explain it to you later, if you don't already understand it, is using ranked choice voting. So we're going to have 9 portfolios, and we're going to look at those portfolios over 4 different scenarios, market cases, market conditions. That's a lot of data. And so if you're looking at 9 options to vote on, 9 portfolios, one of the ways of doing that to get consensus is to allow people to pick their choices and rank them. You don't need 9, you can do 3 or 4. Y'all can decide that if you want to do this. I got to get your decision that you want to do this. And then you go through a process where if you look at the one that a person voted for, their first choice, that is the bottom choice, their second choice gets assigned to where they want their second choice. So you don't completely lose your voice when you lose the first vote. You go through a series of votes where you're continuing bringing the bottom up to their second or third choice. Of getting consensus, if the group says, we don't want any part of that, we won't have any part of it. But we'll talk a little bit more about that. That's what's ahead of us, okay? Are there any questions? I don't know, I can't see the online. We can take this down and put the online thing back up now. Because I don't think people want to look at this anymore. I don't. Any questions? All right, let me have the folks from Burns and McDonald come up if they would, introduce themselves so that each one of you will see them. We're going to, if you want, they'll stay around a little bit after the meeting, visit with them, kind of get to know them, get some of their general thoughts of what they think about where the industry is. But Ravi, come on up, both of you. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Reed. My name is Ravikant Varanasi. Call me Ravi, it's easier. I have 20 years of experience. I've spent a lot of time in the utility consulting space. I'm the managing director for our consulting services out of our Houston office. I'm happy to be a part of this effort. We feel the need to be a part of this, and I think we're going to do everything that we can to make sure this ends in the way that everybody's comfortable with. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Debashish Bose, and I've been in the industry for close to about 20 years. I'm with Burns & McDonald in the Houston office, and I'm the project manager for this engagement. I look forward to working with you all and trying to help you understand the analysis that has been done by CPS Energy and help to make it clear and answer all your questions. So if you have any questions, as I'm sure you will have, please feel free to reach out to me. Houston and other offices throughout the U.S. that will be available to you to help support this effort and help answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, just one more housekeeping point. We know people are going to have questions. We know that questions need to get answered quickly. And to do that efficiently, we're going to use a similar method that we used in the winter storm work. And that is, if you have a question, submit it to us. I'll read it. I'll get it to Ann. We'll put a number on it. We'll submit it to the team from Burns & McDonald. and then they will submit back the answers. It'll come to you, it'll come to all of us, and it gets put on the website. This is a little bit clumsy on the front end, but if we don't do that, we'll get duplicate questions, or we'll get questions that will get asked that have been answered. Sometimes they just don't, people read it, they just don't quite understand that their question got answered. So we'll use that process, and that is outside of the meetings on November the 3rd and the meeting on December 2nd. There, it's just oral questions back and forth, ask them. If I've also asked Burns and McDonald if they have something that they want to present at the beginning of those sessions, they feel free to present it to us if they have something they want to say. So it won't just be your responsibility to ask questions to get something out of the session. Are there any questions on that? Okay, at this point in time, then let's, I'll turn it over to the Charles River Associates. And this time I believe they're online. And I don't know if John or somebody's going to be up here helping them, or are they just going to take it from online? But however y'all want to do it, it's all yours. All we got to do is get you on the screen, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Reed, and good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, and you can bring up the slides, and I can dive into it. And John and others, obviously, feel free to chime in. But we've got several things that we want to talk about today, and just at a very high level, want to recap on the process, and then we've got our 3 core components around planning objectives and metrics, market scenarios, and resource portfolios to go through. So John, I see you're up at the podium. If you want to give any comments or thoughts, please do. Otherwise, we can move into our first overview slide on slide 3 once the deck is up.
So we're having technical issues with the slides, but we'll get them up just as soon as we can.
Okay.
So we can see them in the room. Can y'all see them on the web?
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
This is John Kossip with CPS Energy. Pat Augustine, who has step us through the the latest stage of where we're at with the analysis. So take it away, Pat.
Yeah, thanks, John. So maybe we can advance to slide 3 here, and we'll talk from that. So I want to spend just 15 minutes or so just to level set on the process and where we've been over the last 2 meetings and what we've accomplished and what we plan to present throughout the remainder of the session here. And as always, if there are comments or questions, please feel free to offer them up as we go through this. And then after this overview, as I mentioned, we do plan on hitting each of those 3 initial steps in the process in a little bit more detail for the remainder of the session. So just to recap, this is a slide that we've now presented the last 2 meetings back in July and August, and it really just provides an overview of the 5-step process that we're undertaking here as part of this integrated resource planning approach and generation strategy update. We've largely completed the first 3 steps, and we're going to report out a lot on that today. As Reed just mentioned, in the subsequent meetings, we'll be performing that portfolio modeling and analysis, that's step 4, and ultimately driving towards a preferred plan by the end of the year. But all those initial setup steps have largely been completed. And just as a reminder, the 3 setup steps, if you will, involve identifying planning objectives, developing market scenarios, and developing resource portfolios. So hopefully this is a recap, but I know there's a lot of terms that are somewhat confusing or can be intermatched. So we want to try to just continue to drive home the way that we're thinking about terms and how we speak about them. From an objective perspective, these are the planning objectives and metrics that are used to measure the performance of the different plans that we're going to look at. And as we noted in the last couple of meetings, it's important really to identify those up front, make sure that the decision makers and the RAC advisory committee here is on board, or at least aligned with the types of objectives that we want to evaluate and how we're going to measure them. So we got a lot of good feedback last time, and we'll go over an update there, but that's really a critical first step. The second step is developing market scenarios. So as was noted at the outset here, we've got 4 of those scenarios. And remember, the scenarios are external states of the world and key sources of uncertainty around future outcomes for variables that impact CPS Energy and its customers and the objectives. So that includes things like fuel prices and environmental policy and load growth and market design, and all the uncertainty that goes along with that. And then the third step is developing resource portfolios. So the portfolios are distinct from the scenarios because these are future resource plans that CPS Energy can undertake. They're often based on future scenarios and priorities that the utility or other stakeholders may be interested in. But ultimately, these are CPS Energy decisions and resource portfolios that we will then evaluate against all the scenarios. So those are all the input development steps that get done. And then the analysis involves evaluating those portfolios against scenarios and also against all the other objectives that we've talked about. So uncertainty metrics, we'll talk about the environmental objectives, the reliability, affordability, and others that we've talked about over the last couple meetings, ultimately driving that preferred plan. So just as a recap, to kind of set the stage on where we're going and where we've been. In July, you'll probably remember that we identified the process here at a very high level. We identified initial objectives, and we provided an outline of what those market scenarios are likely to look like, and some suggestions for where CRA would recommend assessing scenarios. Then in August, last month, we came back with a refined set of objectives. We introduced metrics, ways of measuring those objectives, and we got a lot of good feedback in that session, which we'll come back and report today. And we also provided a lot more detail on the scenario parameters. So in July, we gave the concepts. In August, we went through the parameters. And today, we're going to talk a little bit more about the outcomes of those scenarios. And then finally, in August, we also identified portfolio concepts. So these are the CPS Energy concepts. And today, we're going to go into a little bit more refinement on that. So I'll take a pause there just to see if there are any comments or questions on the overall process. Or John, if you have anything to add, otherwise we can kind of move forward and move into the objective section.
I don't see any hands up here in the room. Anything online? Or anyone online? Not sure. Do we have somebody monitoring the online page?
We do, John. I think we're good.
Okay. All right, Pat. Let's keep going.
All right, great. Well, let's move on to the next section. So we'll take a deeper dive here on the planning objectives. If you advance the slides ahead. And as I just noted, back in July, we introduced objectives. In August, we introduced some draft metrics. And we took the pulse of the group in terms of how you all might rank those objectives. And we got a lot of good feedback on the metrics. So if you advance to slide 5, here's a reminder of the 6 planning objectives that have been established. And I think at this point, the team feels like we've got a good perspective on what these core objectives are. And we got some very good feedback through the dot plot exercise that was performed in the August RAC meeting. So just as a reminder, we've got these in alphabetical order. The planning objectives as are laid out were affordability, CPS Energy financial stability, environmental sustainability and climate resiliency, system flexibility, system reliability, and workforce impact. That's CPS Energy workforce impact in particular, although as you might recall, we have a little bit of had a little bit of discussion on San Antonio community economic impacts as well. So in the orange font, we have reported from the RAC meeting in August what the voting tallies were as the different RAC members were asked to provide their input or your input on your priorities. And you might remember that each member had 3 votes and they were assigned to each of the objectives. And at the end of the day, we had, I think, some pretty clear visibility on the top 3 or 4 objectives as represented by the RAC members. System reliability came out on top as quite important for most members, or at least got the most votes. And then environmental sustainability and climate resiliency and affordability were close behind in second and third, followed by CPS Energy financial stability, and then flexibility and workforce impact. So as a reminder, as we go forward, we're not eliminating any of these objectives. We're not deprioritizing them per se when we go through the analysis here, but the voting that was performed gives a good sense of how, when we put the results together and look at all the objectives and metrics, when the committee here makes decisions or debates which portfolios are likely to be preferred, these are the ways that you all can think about how to prioritize things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, there isn't going to be a single score or winning portfolio per se, because we have diverse objectives. But using the rankings or the dot plot vote tallies at least gives the group here a sense of where the priorities are. And as we start to report out on those objectives, get a sense of which ones might be viewed more importantly than others. So again, I'll take a pause here before we get into the metrics, just to see if there was any follow-up or feedback on what we're reporting here related to these 6 objectives.
All right, thank you for that, Pat. We have a question here in the room with, from Michael.
Yeah, this is Michael Kennick. I hate to be a cynic, but I guess I'm trying to figure out what the point was then of this polling. If we're not ranking any of these, we're not dropping any of these, we see 2 of them are below 10%. Why not simplify it and drop 2 objectives? It seems to me like we went through this exercise of polling, and it doesn't sound like we're going to do anything with, other than just for our knowledge of how we all feel. It doesn't look like we're really doing anything with this this ranked polling.
Well, I think, hey, Pat, you could maybe fill us in on some experience that we've had with other utilities and how they've handled the scoring or the use of the planning objectives. And maybe it's when we get into the metrics more, a little bit further down in the deck. But I know we wanted, like you said, we want to get a pulse from the RAC, kind of see where folks are at. These objectives certainly are important to CPS Energy, all 6 of them. We want to kind of look at them, balance them, consider them as we go through the analysis. And Pat, let me turn it over to you to maybe help the RAC understand, ways this can be used, and maybe some ideas on what the RAC may want to do with it.
And I think the point here is that at a high level, CPS Energy wants to continue to report on these objectives. But as we get to the point where the scorecard, the dashboard of results starts getting populated, this can be used as a useful lens to prioritize for individual RAC members which metrics are most important. So for example, we're going to have a lot of data coming out. and we're thinking about how to represent this in the scorecard. And there may be a primary scorecard that focuses on the top 3 objectives, and then a secondary scorecard that will have the other objectives. To the extent, for example, there are portfolios that might be very similar across many objectives, but have some trade-offs. This lens may say, all right, we know affordability, reliability, environmental sustainability are the top 3. And if we've got certain portfolios that seem to be balanced across everything, maybe we focus on those more than the others. So there's certainly a level of trade-off that we're going to see as the scorecard comes together. And this isn't all just a simple scientific plug and play, a bunch of numbers, and out you get a score. But hopefully this gives a perspective on maybe how we present the information. So in our experience, usually what we have is top objectives that get the most credit, in a sense, from how decision makers are looking at them. And then the secondary set of objectives are reported out and make sure that there's nothing severely off or concerning in those objectives if the top 3 or the top 4 are met. So I appreciate that comment, because I think you're right. There's a certain level of feedback that we want to incorporate here, but it really becomes how we look at it at the end of the day. And maybe when it gets to that decision-making process, you'll elect to really focus on the top objectives when you're narrowing down your list of options.
John, I see Anita has a question online, and then Dana, then we'll get next to you.
Go ahead, Anita.
Yes, good afternoon. I guess it's more of a kind of question statement, something I've been thinking about a lot, and that's the umbrella of environmental sustainability and climate resiliency. You know, and I think that I'm probably one of the people that has encouraged us to talk about climate resiliency in a little bit separate away from environmental sustainability, and because when I went back and read the glossary of the definitions, which by the way was very helpful and helped me kind of think about this more, you know, according to the glossary, the meaning behind environmental sustainability and climate resiliency in this instance means, let's see, the exact wording says, it is a planning objective that measures the environmental impact of the CPS Energy generation mix. And so I think the intent there for me was climate resiliency in terms of like increased heat. So not only, you know, the forecasting, future forecasting, but also obviously the resiliency against extreme weather events like heat or the freeze or so on. So I kind of have, it's kind of hard for me to lump those two things in together, because I feel like you know, what the definition says really is just talking about the environmental sustainability, emissions reduction, you know, the impact of our generation, but not really this climate resiliency piece in terms of like being prepared for extreme weather or extreme heat. And I just kind of wanted to, you know, for me, it's kind of like grouping together affordability and workforce impact. You know, I guess I kind of wanted to get your thoughts there. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Anita. And I'll put this out there. They make sense and they're reasonable. I know there is a little bit of overlap in some of these, as you kind of look at system flexibility and reliability. You know, we have extreme weather impacts that we're going to measure in those, and you could group it into flexibility or reliability, and you could debate whether it goes in one or the other. But so climate resiliency, in your mind, I guess you're talking about extremes. We do have a measure for that. We're going to do some sensitivities on that in extreme summer peak and extreme winter peak, and look at the impacts there. Anything else to add, Pat, that might kind of help Anita with that question?
I think you've offered a good response there, John. I mean, in response to the comments in the last RAC meeting, we specifically added 2 metrics, which we'll get to in a second here, on the extreme weather outputs, and we've included those in the reliability and the affordability categories. perhaps there's an overlap, as John said, and you could think of it in some sense in the climate resiliency space. So I think those are the top three metrics or objectives to begin with. You could think about categorizing them differently, as John mentioned. So I think hopefully we're getting at the essence of what you're asking about here, and maybe there's a categorization question and an overlap that we could just work through when the results get presented.
Yes, and listen, I don't have a perfect solution, to it either, but it is something that I've noticed. I think if we lump it in with environmental sustainability, then it just becomes emissions reduction and the impact of our generation. So I think it doesn't hit it yet with the current definition. To your point, I think that, for me, that climate resiliency, and I'm very excited, thank you for adding the additional metrics. I think that climate resiliency piece is more clearly defined within system reliability and system flexibility. And again, I'm just trying to separate it out or define it a little bit more, just because that way we can more measure it instead of just putting it into emissions reduction, if that makes sense.
Anita, this is Reed. I think you're on the right track there. When we get to the metrics, sometimes I find it easier to work back from a metrics into an objective. And so let's look at the metrics and then see what metrics you're comfortable with that could work into one of these. Okay, let's select the next.
Sounds great. Thank you.
We had another hand up in the room here. We got a question from Dana. Go ahead, Dana.
I just wanted a little bit more discussion on these topics that we did vote on, starting with the system reliability. And according to the definition, it says it's power to provide power at any given time. So is that the objective here, the main objective? And is there going to be a discussion about how we're actually going to do that? And for instance, does the calling for all citizens to cut back on electricity, is that part of the discussion, not to have those kind of things? And then going on to the others, the financial stability, of course, that was, it has the definition there, the same kind of metrics that a rating agency would look at. Are we going to have those? How are we going to deal with those if we want to? I guess that's number 4 on the list, so maybe it's not even that important, but would we have numbers on a regular basis so, we could see how whatever we decide is important, they're actually working on it? And then, of course, the last one is the affordability one. Of course, it's tied to the financial stability of CPS itself. If that's going to be an objective, is there going to be a discussion about how we really make it affordable, or what do we do? Because in the latest news, public news, that some 20% of the people can't afford it. So what's the idea here? You can't just talk about it as that's an objective. You have to have an objective, progressive. How are you going to deal with this? Well, that's a lot of questions, but
No, that's similar to Anita's, because if we're going to study something, we've got to be able to measure it. So again, let's kind of circle back on that after we get into the metrics and the measures and see if that gets anywhere close to. If it doesn't, we need to put new metrics and measures in, Dana. Okay, because just talking about these kind of off the top without looking what we're planning to measure them by is kind of hard. But so let's think about that. All right, we're getting ready to go on to the metrics.
Yeah, so good discussion. We'll drill down and then work our way back up and see if it's still making sense as we kind of iterate through this. So Pat, if there's no other questions, we'll move on to slide 6.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a real good transition, and those comments really hopefully can get addressed to some extent on these different metrics. So you'll probably recall from August, we laid out some draft concepts here, and just to reemphasize the point, we've got these objectives that we're aiming towards, but in order to try to understand how the different portfolio options are going to achieve or not achieve those objectives, we need ways of measuring them. And we've identified metrics and measures that can come out of the portfolio analysis. And as I hinted at before, there's a lot here, and there will be a lot reported as the analysis gets done. So having a way to organize this information into a scorecard and prioritize it is where we'll be going next. But this is really the proposed final draft of these measures. We took a lot of feedback from the discussion on last month's meeting and refined these. So I think there are two primary areas where we made refinements. First is that extreme weather discussion. So you'll probably recall from August, we didn't really have any specific measures that were really hitting on that targeted risk or resiliency metric, and we've added some here. And then secondly, we took the feedback about let's focus more on the rest of this decade as opposed to a lot of long-term analysis that goes out 20, 30 years. Obviously, these models do get run that long because we have long-lived assets that could be added to the portfolio, and we want to ensure that we capture the full planning horizon. But in terms of measuring where the system is likely to be, let's focus a little bit more on the near to midterm, and we revised those things accordingly. So I'll run through this slide and the next slide and then open it back up to comments and questions. So from an affordability perspective, the metrics that we're focused on here are bill impact and revenue requirements. And as a reminder, the definition here of revenue requirements is what CPS Energy as an electric utility requires in terms of revenue that is collected from customers in order to operate the system. And that includes a whole series of fixed and variable costs associated with owning or building or operating or contracting with power plants and power generating facilities, and all the variable items that go into operating those facilities, such as fuel or any emissions obligations or other. So those are the two metrics. And then translating that into measures, what are the actual numbers and projections that we can report? First, our estimated monthly bills. And we'll have a way to look at the reference case that will come first, and then across the different scenarios. So what do we project? If the portfolio were to evolve in this direction, what does that mean for expected monthly bills at some point in the future, in the near future, under our reference case conditions, and then under these different scenario outcomes that we'll talk about in more detail here a little bit later today. And then from a revenue requirement perspective, what is the present value of those revenue requirements? So the expectations over a period of time, present valued back to current dollars, in the remainder of this decade, which we heard is more of a priority. And then, as is typical in resource planning engagements, a long-term view, just to make sure you're not missing any near-term versus long-term costs and benefits that may be associated with different portfolio options. So those are the second and the third on the list. And then the extreme weather is in addition. So based on the feedback that we heard last time, what does an extreme weather event, and as John said, we're going to be looking both at winter and summer extremes. What does that mean or imply for the revenue requirements? What are the extra costs that customers would have to face, or revenue requirements that CPS Energy would face under extreme weather conditions under each of the portfolios? So those are the ways that we plan to measure affordability. Again, each portfolio that will be evaluated will have measures for each of these line items. From a financial stability perspective, as was just noted, there are metrics that rating agencies and others are looking at. And I think last time there was discussion on this, and there are three typical measures: debt capitalization ratio, adjusted debt service ratio, and cash on hand ratios that are relevant to the financial stability of CPS Energy. And in response to feedback, we want to try to focus on a simple view in the future after the portfolio decisions that'll come out of this process are made. So not too far out in the long term. But in order to make this meaningful and easy to digest, we want to pick a point in time that makes sense. And 2030 is kind of that benchmark year that we're we're thinking about. And those are the reports for financial stability. On the environmental front, I think the comment that was raised before is a good one, because a lot of the metrics that we've come up here are focused on the sustainability side of things, in that we're looking at CO2 intensity, specifically associated with the City of San Antonio's Climate Action and Adaptation Plan goals. So the carbon intensity of electricity generated by the CPS Energy fleet at points in time, again, focusing on 2030 and 2040 as an out year. In the last meeting, we also had a 2050 goal, of course, but I think the focus is really the near-term progress. Similarly, we can report the reduction in gross CO2 emissions in 2030. And then there has been interest in energy efficiency impacts within this category. So what is the percent reduction in electricity demand due to energy efficiency measures? That will be stable in a lot of the portfolios, but as we mentioned earlier, there are some energy efficiency or step sensitivities that will be looked at as part of the process down the line, and that will get a sense of how those different sensitivity portfolios stack up. So if we go to the next slide, we've got the other three objectives. System flexibility. This one, as we talked about.
I'm
Oh,
sorry, Pat.
question. No problem.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Dr. Country. I had a question. I put it in that I had a question in the chat, but it was about this, so I didn't want you to go on without. And
Yep, please go ahead. Sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. So really quick question on metrics or the measures for affordability. No, I guess you went on to the next slide. Could you go back to the previous slide? The one about affordability. Looking at affordability in the measure, you were estimated monthly bills. Okay, so that measure is going to be looked at with reference cases and scenarios. And one of the things I didn't hear in that, and it may be included, is a measure of people that live, or at least customers that live at or below the poverty level, or maybe a certain percentage of the poverty level. Should that not be a metric that we're looking at as we estimate the monthly bills, and what kind of impact it will be on what we think will be people that live at or near or just above the poverty level?
Yeah, Dr. Cantu, this is John Kossop. We're going to take a look at a range of things. When Chad's Hoopengarner will be here about 4 o'clock. He had a conflict, but we can maybe circle back to that. I know we're going to look at various rate groups for monthly bills, and we'll take a look at a range, and maybe Chad can give some specifics on that.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to be sure that it was going to be included as a metric that we measure, because I think, unfortunately, we're still seeing San Antonio being one of the most impoverished cities. And I want to be sure that that's considered. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
And I think Anita has a question as well.
Thank you so much. I kind of just want to go back to this, and this was actually really great to kind of see these presented in this manner, and thank you for going through them. I kind of want to go back to the environmental sustainability and climate resiliency, because I had a thought. I feel like, the reason why I don't like them lumped together is because the climate resiliency piece has been lumped in with the sustainability aspect, with emissions reduction and reducing, and second, because it's been complicated to really, because there is overlap in some of these other areas, so it was kind of hard to define. So here's my thought. In a way, I would almost like to see this separated into environmental impact, which covers everything that you've listed there, and separate actually out a new metric, which would be climate adaptation and resiliency. So that would handle things like the weatherization of our power generation, and in the context of extreme heat or cold. It would be like the integration with our critical infrastructure, or those type of things. The reorganizing of how we would handle the outages in the future. All of those type of things in that bucket, and maybe even this the idea of as we move forward in time, the increased heat, the future cast, like preparing for that piece specifically. Another piece would be a very long-term problem that we will have. You know, it's a 50, 100-year problem, which is like our infrastructure and the plan to maybe bury, you know, power lines and in the urban core and so on, the older parts of town. I know it's $1 million a mile. It seems impossible now, but we do need to begin looking at some of these things. And then, you know, because again, my end point there is, you know, climate resiliency, that's that adaptation piece. And so I do feel strongly it should be separated from environmental impacts. My last question or point there, and that's something that I think about a lot. I know it might be buried within another category, but again, I think we need to spell it out. Well, because again, if we're talking about for over the next several decades, it's going to be electrification of transportation is going to be a major impact long term, I think, on San Antonio. And I think that we somehow will have to, you know, instead of following that market as we are, you know, everyone kind of is now, I think we do need to think long term. And the reason is because it's not just about people buying cars, it's because San Antonio is like a crossroads of like trucking and transportation. And so when you pull up all of those large trucks, as you know, that demand of power in an area not designed for it, the intensity of that power and the availability of that, those are things that we will have to long-term plan for. So that was kind of the end of my comments. I'd love to hear any thoughts anyone has. Thank you.
Anita, this is Reed. Okay, if we're going to create another objective, as you're asking, I guess you could leave her on if you don't mind. However, that was working pretty good. Are you there, Anita? Are you there? Okay.
Yes, sir. I'm right here.
So if we're going to create another category under planning objectives, that's going to have to take more thought and time than we can do it right here on the fly. So I've asked John to get with you and see if there's a way to develop a new planning objective to meet what you're talking about. And also, and let's see if we can get that. I don't know, but I know that's a pretty big lift right here on the fly.
Absolutely, and understood. And I think that, you know, again, it's not going to be something that's going to be solved this afternoon, but I wanted to bring it up, hear other people's thoughts, and say, like, I do think that if we're going to make something like that happen, we need to begin that discussion now. And yeah, but I do feel very strongly that we should, even if it takes a while, we should separate those two things.
All right. Well, we'll have to figure out what the measurements are, what the metrics are, and then work back to what you're saying as an objective. But that we can't. We appreciate you bringing it up, but we can't.
Understood. Yes, sir.
All right. Go ahead.
Thanks.
All right. Do we have any other questions? No, there's 3 more. There's 1 more page. Okay, Pat,
Yep.
take it away on slide 7.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just, some real quick reactions to Anita's comments, and we'll take that offline. I think those are well taken. A couple of those probably fall somewhat either in other parts of the analysis or outside the scope. So for example, you know, undergrounding distribution lines are a little different from the generation planning that we're looking at here. So although that's a valid resiliency measure, it may not be relevant to the specific task at hand at looking at generation. And then good point on the electrification. As we go through the scenarios, you may recall that our net zero economy scenario is premised, one of the variables, on significant electrification from the transport and other heating and other sectors. So we do pick that uncertainty up that we'll model in the scenarios. So I think some of that can get measured, but we'll, you know, take it offline with John and others on some of the other comments to see if there's other ways to address them.
Thank you.
Yeah, Pat, let me add something, Pat, there. I was also thinking maybe there's an opportunity to potentially group it with system reliability, where we show the market purchases in extreme weather. You know, it's kind of getting at a financial impact or risk related to reliability or resiliency in extreme weather. So think about that, and we'll take that one offline though. Thank you.
Yep, yeah, agree with that. So just on these last three metrics, we'll go through them just as I did on the prior slide. So system flexibility, we talked about this in a bunch of different ways. I think there were some initial questions even back in the July meeting about, what does this mean? Flexibility makes a lot of sense, but how can we really measure it? And we've landed in these two areas around market purchases and dispatchability as being items that can be measured across portfolios. So the market purchases concept is the percent of CPS Energy electricity demand that is met through ERCOT market purchases in 2030 as our benchmark year that we're focused on. So as you know, CPS Energy sits within the ERCOT market. There's a constant ability to sell and buy to and from that market. But one way to look at the flexibility of the portfolio might be, how much are you relying on the market due to the resources that you've added as opposed to your own resources. And then secondly, dispatchability. This is the percentage of generating capacity that CPS Energy can have or that can control its output on demand. So for example, a solar or wind facility would not be dispatchable, but a battery would be. You can control the discharging, and a gas facility would be dispatchable. So a way of looking out at 2030 again, what percentage of the generating capacity has that flexibility to change its output on demand? Then in reliability, we've referenced this a couple times now that market purchases in extreme weather is a new addition. So last time we talked about reserve margin, what that means, and diversity. But in terms of trying to finalize these measures, we've added that market purchases in extreme weather. So it's somewhat similar to the flexibility comment before, but the idea here would be, well, in an extreme weather condition, whether it's the summer or the winter, what does the portfolio's market purchase exposure look like? And having different resources in the portfolio that have different attributes will have different outcomes here. So it's one way to measure from an extreme weather event perspective, what type of exposure CPS Energy would have to that ERCOT market. In addition to that, the reserve margin, as we talked about last time, is really a planning concept as you look forward. What's the amount of capacity that you have relative to peak load expectations? And then diversity, lots of ways to think about this, but I think a simple way is really the pie chart. And I think we talked about this last time, just a visual on the fuel or the resource by type, again, in a benchmark year in the near term, 2030. And then finally, around the workforce impact, these are quite similar to what we talked about last time. We could do a CPS Energy generation fleet employee count expectation based on the resources in the fleet. And then the local economic impact, which did come up in some comments. Again, different ways to measure it, tough to be precise, but we could at least record the total dollars in capital expenditures for new generation capacity that would be built in the greater San Antonio area as a metric for that. So that wraps up this section here, and I'll turn it back to you, John or Reed, and open up to questions and comments.
Okay, we've got time here, so this is really an important step to look at these metrics, look at the measures, and actually see if those are doing what you want them to do, because in the end, that's all the data sales we're going to be looking at. All right. Okay, we'll start. We'll take questions, and some.
Just sorry about the interruption there, Reed, but Pat, can you just maybe mention we'll have additional detailed data that we can drill into. If you want to know something about 2025, we'll have it, things like that. So maybe speak just briefly about that, Pat.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The idea here is, at the end of the day, to turn this into a couple of slides that can all be consolidated in what we're calling a scorecard or a metrics dashboard, where we can use a couple simple handouts to look at key trade-offs. We're going to have a lot of data, of course, but these are the headline numbers to try to get at those high-level trade-offs. But behind the scenes, the portfolios are going to be run over multiple years. We're going to have all the scenario portfolio combinations as we go forward in the next 2 months. And through the RAC peer advisor and the RAC here, any questions on that or further detailed review on items that are of relevance are certainly available. This is just a way to try to distill all of that into the best summary that we can make and try to turn all that data into a couple pages that can highlight the key trade-offs. So it doesn't eliminate all the other backup data, or if there's other information that is of interest, it will still be available, but we're trying to make this into a reasonable summary set.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take the questions here in the room, then we'll move to the folks online. And let's start, who wants to ask questions first? This is the most important thing, other than understanding the market conditions. They call them scenarios. This is the most important thing we're going to work on today. Okay, we don't get this right. Okay, let's just start here on the right. We'll move on around. Femi, you're first. Let's try to keep it to like 5 minutes so we can get to everybody.
I just want to come back to this question of time frame or planning horizon. And I want to leave this meeting with a clear understanding of what we're doing at 2050, what we're doing at 2023 or 2030, what we're doing at 2010, or what we're doing in 8 years' time. It's still very confusing. And John just said that, yes, we will have data available for any time we intend to, but I want to know the plan to actually incorporate these different timeframes into the generation planning exercise. I don't want to have to wait to ask for something in 2025 or in 2035. I want to see that plan upfront to know how you all are building these different short, medium, and long-term issues into this planning exercise. It's still a lot confusing. I don't know. I don't quite understand how these time frames are working out.
Okay, Femi, we'll have a 25-year run for each portfolio, each result. We'll have 25 years of data. The focus for this exercise, this Gen Planning Update, is the next 6 years. The period that we have gas steam capacity that's forecasted to retire. And also, we've been asked by the board to take a look at the spruce coal units to determine their viability, the viability of discontinued use of coal by 2030. So that's that 2028, 2030 timeframe. That short timeframe is what we want to focus on and put the most emphasis on. But it's prudent to look long-term as these are long-term decisions and investment in assets, that we want to make sure we get a reading on what's possible long-term with the certain decision. So does that help?
It helps a bit, but here's the reason why I'm asking these questions. And thanks for at least indicating that you'll be doing a 25-year projection. I'm concerned that some decisions have to be made in the next 5 years, let's say. If I were to ask, for example, what are the chances that a decision you'll make in the next 5 years will foreclose a decision you would have made in the next 15 years versus retain the flexibility to make another decision in the next 15 years? Example, again, case in point, just 10 years ago or 12 years ago, we built the spruce coal plants. Some will look back today and say that was a bad decision because of what had happened in the intervening years. Now, some would say it was a good decision because it was the best that could be done at that time. So when we start making decisions, and I'm saying this because I know that we're going to make a decision now, and some of the repercussions will not occur for another decade or so. And this is part of planning. This is the time to put in place things that we will either be stuck with or we might regret later on. That's the honest truth. That's what happens. We're not going to build the plans today and destroy it in the next 5 years because it wasn't a good decision.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good point. So the scorecard that Pat mentioned, the focus is reference case, what we believe the forecast is going to look like for the next 25 years. But we have the 3 other scenarios, net zero, net carbon, the carbon-based economy, net zero emissions, a volatile market. So we can take those results from the portfolio. You think maybe I like this certain portfolio and test it against these 3 other future conditions to see how it holds up against other market conditions that could pan out. It could play out in year 15, like you said. So keep that in mind as we go, keep drilling down into this and see if that's starting to kind of make sense, and if it gives you some comfort that we've got a broad range of things we're looking at in a comprehensive manner.
Femi, I'd also say, and you know this because you do a lot of planning, but when we get to the cost curves, the forward cost curves, we need to really look at those because that's going to answer your question. I think a lot of the decisions have been made in the past based on current conditions, and they don't stay there, okay? And so I think by looking at a variable set of market conditions, we can kind of see which one might be the most resilient under a number of conditions, not knowing what the future is going to be. So I think the future cost curves under each one of these, what they call scenarios, is going to be something we really need everybody to focus on when we get to that, okay? And that'll be here in just a few minutes, but you're right. Okay, is that it, Femi? Okay, Michael?
Okay, I want to focus in on the financial stability. So we have some ratios here. Just need to know, are there any desired ratios that we're trying to shoot for? And then I guess a bigger question is, should we have ever had CPS financial stability as an objective, being that that underlies all the other objectives, or that underlies everything that we're trying to do, doesn't it?
Yeah, good point. So are you thinking those should just be a constant, that we have to meet those, like a must-have gate or something like that?
Right, where it should have never been an objective, so we should have never voted on it. That's what I believe. Spoke to some other, well, let's just say that it seems that it's just a constant that we don't need to be thinking about. It's a given, financial stability.
Okay, let me talk on that point because I have a similar concern. And what they're doing is they're looking at the metric in 2030 because it can be a lot. Well, you get in problems in the meantime, like you never go broke, not making profit, you run out of money, you're broke. So I think there are standards that they want to hit, and perhaps looking at the percent of time or the occurrences that they're off of the standard over a period of time will give you what you're looking for. It's not necessarily that we have to run the model of that. It's the model tells us how many times we don't meet those. And so that's another concern I have, and I'll talk about it more in a minute. You're right, Mike. Anything else? Michael.
Yeah, under system flexibility, we have the measure of percentage of CPS Energy electric demand that is met through ERCOT market purchase, when that, of course, is a critical one because we don't want to become over-dependent on ERCOT. I'm wondering if we're going to look at any portfolios so that sort of flips that over and estimates how much power we might be selling into the ERCOT market. This is a business, and there may be some scenarios where we should be planning on being a wholesale producer to sell back into the market.
Yeah, net sales is going to be included. That's in the model. It'll simulate like what we do today, purchases, sales, and then running the power plant fleet. So that'll be in there. We can extract it, look at it any number of ways. So.
Is that all, Michael? Okay, go ahead, Peter.
Peter Onofre, thank you, Reed. First, before I ask my question to Pat, I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge the RFP Consultant Selection Committee process. Thank you, Rudy and leadership team, for the opportunity to be a part of that process. I thought it was very educational and a very productive use of our time in helping us to prepare for where we are today. I'd also like to thank Reed and Dr. Cantu for your leadership throughout that process, and of course the fellow members that were a part of that committee. And of course, welcome, congratulations to Burns and McDonald. Thank you for your willingness to serve us, and look forward to working with you. Now to my question, Pat. I had raised this question in the August meeting about the reliability metrics and measures. And I just want to revisit it and get a good understanding with the step capacity savings being a sensitivity. It's on the demand side. And I just wanted to better understand if it's going to be factored in here when we look at the measure being the pie chart generation planning of CPS portfolio by fuel type. That's got wind, solar, gas, coal. And it's been referenced as a fifth fuel. If it would not also be part of that measure to show how much that capacity savings is in fact reducing what is part of the generation that's not there. So that's my question.
Yeah, Peter, it's on page 29, so we'll be getting to that sensitivity that we'll be doing for energy efficiency. Pat, the previous slide, or can we go back to slide 6? We do have a measure with energy efficiency right at the very bottom right-hand corner, the percent reduction due to energy efficiency measures in 2030. So that's envisioned as being part of that, environmental sustainability and climate resiliency objective.
So under the climate environmental sustainability and climate resiliency, that's where you're factoring it in.
It's in there, but also there'll be a sensitivity study to give us some more visibility or additional details regarding that. That's slide 29 that we'll be getting to.
Okay, so just to clarify the question about it being a measure versus a sensitivity, that's my question. Can you clarify the difference there and how we would be able to see it as a measure? Is that?
Well, no. What it is a measure. It's a sensitivity case off the reference case. It's an alternative off the reference case. When we say sensitivity, we're talking about running another case that shows what you're saying, what you're asking, I think. Look on page 29. We'll get to that in a minute. I think that's what they put in for what your question was.
Yes, and that's what's driving my question is looking at that scenario. I'm trying to front end.
Yeah, in other words, we've got 9 portfolios, but for the reference case, to get to answer your question, we're going to do some sensitivity off of those with that.
Maybe we can have Pat. Pat, do you want to just maybe give us a little bit of preview of that and answer Peter's question?
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a good point on the pie chart too. I think we could take that comment directly into account here. I think it's fair to say that we could measure that DSM or energy efficiency as a component of the mix very easily. So from a reporting perspective, we'll take that comment into account and add it there into that measure. That measure is just a pie chart of the whole system, and we can add a slice for DSM. In terms of the sensitivity treatment, as I think John and Reed just mentioned, the idea here would be to have an alternative sensitivity portfolio where we have more or less step energy efficiency, run that, and then go back and report it in these measures. So we will see, as John pointed out, percent reduction in electricity demand. That'll look different in this sensitivity. The costs, the bill impact, the revenue requirements, those will look a little different. So it'll roll through this entire table. And to your comment there, the pie chart could look a little different if we adjusted it. So the idea here would be to have a sensitivity portfolio that has the change in energy efficiency, and then we come back to these measures and see how that performs. And it's not going to be different on every single one, but a couple of the key measures that we just pointed on, we'll be able to see the change.
Thank you, Pat. I appreciate that. And I'm going to ask this question. You don't have to answer it now, but you're going to address it later in the presentation. But why is it only going to be run under the reference scenario versus the others?
This optimization, including optimization of energy efficiency, would be a very, very big challenge, right? That's something that could potentially be a future study to get more detailed. We think we're going to get really good information from this sensitivity. It'll be based on option 3 that the SRAC team saw, where it was additional spending. What are you going to get for that extra maybe 20 megawatts at peak, accumulated each year? The scale of that is, we need about 2,000 megawatts that we're dealing with here. So 20 megawatts is a good chunk, but much smaller. So we think that's a good way to handle it, to tie it into what you've seen, and then see if we want to drill into it more. But it'd be a pretty big task to do a more sophisticated optimization. If that makes sense.
All right, I'll come back to that. Another point, I disagree. I think it should be in all the scenarios, but we can get back to that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Dee Dee, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. On environmental sustainability and climate resiliency, the measure reduction in carbon emissions, is that on a life cycle basis, both on and off-site? And my second question would be, could we include criteria and other pollutants along with carbon emissions as a measurement?
Sorry, Dee Dee, can you repeat the first one? I didn't catch it.
On carbon emissions, the reduction in carbon emissions, is that on a life cycle basis, both on and off-site? And did you get the second one?
Yeah, I got the second one. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's inside the fence. It's not taking into account external conditions. It's power plant CO2 emissions. And the second question, yeah, we can include SOx and NOx. We'll take a look at that feedback and see how to incorporate that. Are you suggesting that be in the kind of this main measure here, or the data will be available for SOx and NOx?
Yeah, yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Because we're thinking, how do we simplify this to work?
Pollutants,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
But so you're saying that the emissions are not on a life cycle basis, it's just,
That's correct.
okay.
Dana? Al? Okay, let's go online. Who have we got first? Okay, Anita, you're on.
Hi, thank you. So first I want to actually kind of back up a second. I want to thank Dana, I think it was, that sent the state energy plan advisory committee report to us last night. That was actually not on my radar at all, and so I was I was very grateful to that you sent that out. Anyway, I read it, and it, it's a long report, but there's really about 38 critical pages, and a really good summation of it is, I think, page 43 to 45. Now, I guess my questions are, I guess, to CPS and to our consultants, or really open it up to anyone else. I mean, I think that they're when I read 43 through 45, which kind of just bottom lines their recommendations here. That, I don't know if you know about that committee, but basically they're kind of tasked to improve grid reliability and market outcomes. And it's this market outcomes piece. I mean, the grid reliability stuff, obviously it's Senate Bill 3. I think it was a response to Winter Storm Uri and what happened here in Texas. So there's a lot of really positive things on that will happen because of that. But it's the other side about the market outcomes, and there were some surprising things that I've read so far. I'm gonna have to go back and reread this thing again, but I think it's going to have a big impact on system flexibility and system reliability. Ancillary services, all of it in the future. And there was a couple of really big things that jumped out at me, having to deal with how they're leaning towards natural gas, and also how they're not going to give preference to any new type of generation. I mean, there's a lot of little details in there without getting to everything. I just want to open that up. I mean, I think it's something that we have to, really keep a close watch because they are going to, the decisions that they're making are obviously going to impact CPS Energy, our grid as well, and how we do business, our generation business in the future. And I guess that was my main question.
And Anita, that really relates directly on where we think the scenarios are going to be. So when we get to those scenarios, that is where we have to make sure that the impacts that they were reporting in that report, which, you know, some of us have looked at, get properly reflected in one of the four scenarios so that we can at least have a look-see at it, okay?
I
And
also think it wouldn't hurt, you know, because I do realize, you know, that it's a lot of reading. I mean, in the future, I think it wouldn't hurt if we got kind of a quick couple of slides. I mean, again, it's like page 43, 45. I mean, some of the bigger points that we need to consider and present that to the committee in kind of an abbreviated way, because what they will do on the state level will have there's some big things that will be coming, as you know.
you're correct. Okay. Anything else?
I'm really anxious to hear the feedback, to hear what CPS has to say, hear our consultants, you know, very curious about your thoughts on that. Thank you.
On the report?
Yes,
Okay.
sir. And how that directly impacts, I mean, I guess, you know, questions like, listen, I didn't even know that report came out on the 1st. So, you know, I really, you know, kind of moved through it quickly. But I guess my question was, you know, I'm assuming that someone has been watching this and integrating some of these, because when I started reading what some of the way that they're leaning, I was very surprised by it. And I think it's going to be a really big impact on our grid. So again, very curious to hear what the thoughts of CPS Energy and our consultants are.
And Anita, that's exactly right. If you look at page 11 on our report, there's a whole column here on what we think's going to happen at CPS. I mean, not CPS, at ERCOT. And again, that was a very political group, and they didn't even get very good votes for it. So it's got some real controversy around it. And we do need to have discussion on that with the consultants. So I encourage you that if you have specific questions on that, when we get down to that on those two meetings, let's get those aired, okay?
And to your point, I mean, it was like 7-5, you know, so that's a real slippery slope there too. And that's like a whole other variable, because as to your point, it was apparently a very controversial vote.
Okay, and another thing, Linda, we've got some people here that have been following CPAC, so we'll ask them to get with you and y'all can have some dialogue on that to see where they think they're going, okay? All right? Okay, who else is online?
Excuse me, Dr. Cantu had questions.
Okay, Dr. Cantu, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. My question had to do with the workforce. If you could go to that slide, I believe it's the next slide over, and I wanted to ask about the measures or just some clarity on that. Okay. Oh, it was there. It was just there. Yes, on the measures, the number of CPS Energy generation employees in 2030, going from the metric of the workforce impact. So are we thinking about, is that measure, and maybe this is what the measure needs to do, is it measure taking in new employees that are for future generation planning, or the conversion, the transition of present workers to workers in renewable energy, or are those in that, are they in that umbrella? Just wanted to be sure that we're measuring that.
Hi, Dr. Cantu.
Thank you.
Dr. Cantu, Benny Etheridge here. Yes, ma'am. That we're looking at our total number of employees at the time in 2030. It'll include all changes.
Good, thank you. Just wanted to be sure.
And Reed, Councilwoman Viagran has a question next.
Okay. Go ahead, Councilwoman.
Thanks. Well, it's additional questions that people already brought up, but I wanted to say that these were my questions too. Dr. Femi's question about generational planning, and if we're going to look at something and say maybe we should have tried X over Z, but I think you're going to cover that in the different scenarios. But I like what I hear in terms of the 25 years, but when you bring something for the next 6 years. But it I know we didn't ask you to go further than 25 years, but 25 years, I want us to just plan as far in the future as we can. I think it was Michael that mentioned that the CPS financial stability should just be a given, and I agree with him on that. If CPS isn't financially viable, then the other objectives just they're just mute because we're looking at rate hikes, and I do want to see us look at the possibility to sell to ERCOT, especially as we are in the foreseeable future in this system that is the Texas system. And this is how the system works is we sell to the grid. And what can we do that? What can we do with that if we have a facility that's generating a lot of energy? Because again, I'm going to say I for that affordability, preventing rate increases is key to, I think, affordability for the ratepayers. And I understand the political aspect, but I would really like to focus on the generational planning and the climate portion of this rather than the politics of it. But I'm not sure that we can. But can we? Is there a way we can keep the politics out and just focus on the generational and the like the technology portion of it? That's my final question.
Well, I concur with your desire, and we'll try to do as much as we can. There's certainly in that report that Anita was talking about, there's plenty of politics in that. So we do have to constantly be vigilant about separating the politics or the aspirational politics, if you will, from what the facts are. So sometimes that's difficult. We'll do our best. Thank you very much. Anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you, Reed.
All right, and just very briefly, I've got a couple of things I want to make clear on. When we're talking about revenue requirement, we've got two things. What affects the rate that the city council votes on is the revenue requirement, but what affects the user, the customer, is the revenue requirement that affects the rate plus the fuel adjustment. So we have to be careful that we designate and distinguish between those two, and I assume we are. If we're not, we need to, because to the councilwoman's point, if something comes to them that affects the rate, as we take more and more out of the rate and it goes into the fuel adjustment, the rate increases will not go to the council. The cost will just go to the individual customer. So we need to look at those separate. Also, last time I asked that we use a metric, develop a metric for utilization. It can either go under affordability or under reliability. It affects both of them, but we need to know what how we're using our plants. In the old days, when we had a fixed level, we ran those at 100% or real close to it, and then we just put peakers in. Now that we have the variability by renewables, we have to understand how much we're using both our renewables and our dispatchable power, our batteries, however you want to look at it, to provide that reliability. So utilization of our equipment will become much more critical. Hopefully we can work that in. Also on the financial ratios, just looking at the financial ratio, back to Michael's point, at 2030, it isn't going to probably be the metric we need. I know we have an interest in keeping this simple, but if we can look at the months or some time period that we are not in compliance with what we our targets, okay, and we have targets for every one of these. When we can see when we're out of the range for the targets and report that, that might be a better indication of where during this period of time we might get in trouble, because it's not at the end of the nail. It's not a terminal deal. We could go terminal before we get there. Also, in the workforce, that's a really important point. because workforces transition, and I do think we need to think a little bit more about the metrics there on how we see retention and transition. Because if we're we always need good people. Our people are good people. We just need to see if we can transition them and use them. So I think we got to look at that. So that's really it. Let's be sure that we understand the difference between the revenue requirement that the city council has to vote on and the total cost that comes to our customers. We got to look at the financial ratios against a benchmark, and we've got to look at utilization in there because utilization has become important. If we don't have utilization, we're wasting capital. Anything else?
I think we have one more question from Anakwa online.
Thank you, and this is Anakwa in District 2. And forgive me because I'm going to sound long-winded, but I have to say something. And I think that what issues we are confronting with these metrics and separating them is realizing that they're all very interconnected. And I have to speak of the system that we are all built on, which is a carbon market system. And what I believe is a core issue here is that we have compartmentalized and separated something that should exist as a whole. And we've kind of built a pyramid, a point system to approach to this, which I believe is a flaw. And that is because we have taken economy, what we consider an economy, eco meaning home, our home, and NAMI meaning the management of our home being our planet, and subsequently the land, water, air, and everything else. And as a species, we have separated the true meaning of economy and created what we call a market economy. And within that exists a carbon market scheme. Sorry. Which is the baseline of energy generation at CPS and around the world. And these markets create unsustainable growth on the necks of workers, marginalized communities, and nature itself. And so what these markets and economic institutions lack are preservation, enhancement, and restoration of the biotic community of which we as humans are a part of, right? And so trying to put natural resources back into the market is a wrong approach. The current economic system is ill-equipped to handle the current climate crisis and biodiversity loss. Worse, it is directly responsible for these problems in the first place. And so when we talk of, capitalism and a competitive economy, that works against us figuring out on a mass scale how to address the climate crisis. And this is where cooperation instead of competition cooperation instead of competition should take that place. And it is a critical and structural change that is needed. And so the ideology of exponential growth, which is what our city is based on and what much of the country, much of the world, developed world, must reconcile with, is that exponential growth is directly connected to the degradation of all life and biodiversity, including our lives here in San Antonio. And so I call on us to try and shift this paradigm and lacking the ability to snap our fingers and change instantly, when the reality is that for this to happen, it will take generations. But we have to start somewhere, and we have to start now. And for me, that means double down on leaving carbon market schemes behind, leaving fossil fuels in the ground, and investing in renewables and innovation. And so all that to say that we are in a circle, and you're asking us to break these up into pieces when, like, Councilman Viagran said, take the political out. Existence is political, and we can't really, it would be wrong. It would be a moral wrong to disassociate from some of these pieces. And I just wanted to say that, and to lead me to ask if any kind of innovative non-carbon markets, or even recognizing that carbon markets are the issue, because otherwise I feel like we're working on a house of cards. And I recognize that this is a really enormous shift that would have to happen. But coming back to starting somewhere, I would like to know if any of these proposals that we're seeing, any of these scenarios will push back on that, and how can we work to push back on that as well? Thank you.
Reed, this is Wayne Addington. I'm just getting late. I've been traveling. I told you about it. Did you bring forth the comments that I'd made about the metrics that I brought up to some of the RAC members in the last month about CPS financial stability and personnel? Once again, to me, that's a CEO and a board type of item. If we don't have stability, then we're not going to have any of the other items. I think I heard a few comments on the end of that. And also, I had brought up that I'd like to toss out to CPS about possibly doing residential solar. I noticed with my panels, for example, when the power, in the peak power time, my house totally comes off the grid, but I also produce power to put in the grid to help at peak times. And then later on, when it's no longer peak time, that's when I get the energy back. So I apologize for being late. I just heard some of the comments about the CPS energy stability and so on, but I just wanted to make sure that my comments got in.
Yeah, Wayne, I think I did okay on the stability, the financial stability, where I'm saying we need to know the number of occurrences or the times that we're out of, that a portfolio under a scenario puts us out of range with our metrics of where we need to meet for the bond folks. I think I tried to do it there. As far as the solar panels, I think those get picked up with the sensitivity work on if we put more money into the STEP program on the and it might not, and if it doesn't, we'll circle back on it. But as we look at those 3 additional cases that we're doing on the reference case where we're putting more money into the STEP program, you know, that could be in solar panels or community solar, as we talked. So that's where I was trying to get at that. I thought it was there. If it doesn't, we'll circle back and get it for you, Wayne.
Okay, well, yeah, I was talking about more of the residential than in that program, because then the customer's paying. But looking at some of the data I found on the purchase of these items, CPS can get involved. And that, of course, in turns, the customer's paying for it. But in turn, it's still helping CPS and the other customers. Okay, so but anyway, I'm out here. I'm just listening. Thank you very much.
No problem, Wayne. And I think people realize that rooftop solar, as you're talking about, has tremendous advantages for the community. And I believe that program, while it's not in the STEP program, it might in some way get supported. So, all right, Benny has a comment here. Then we're going to go to break. We're almost right on time.
Thank you, Reed. Nakwa, I'd like to go back to your question real quick. Yes, we do have an option, I think, that addresses your request, and that's the 100% renewable option. So I think that's covered in the process, and we're looking forward to seeing the analysis on that and how they lay it out there. I also wanted to go back to Dr. Femi, your question, your concern, and Councilwoman Viagran's about decisions we make, near term, long term, and the potential implications. we're doing a 25-year study so we can better understand what the opportunities are. But the first thing we have to do, and that's where we're really looking for you all to help us, is make decisions about what we can do right now. We need to start next year. When you look at timelines, we honestly, a couple of projects, if we're going to do them, we should have started this year. We need to start next year and make provisions to move forward with generation of some kind to cover the 3,000 megawatts we're going to be shifting out. And there's only a few choices that we have available to us in the market today. Okay, there's natural gas facilities that are out there in the market. We can try and find something for sale. We can try and build. Again, they would be natural gas facilities. And then there's solar, and then there's wind. And then there's lithium-ion batteries to the extent that we can develop these projects in a timely manner. We've had some real challenges just working forward because of supply chain challenges, okay, and moving these projects along. I will tell you, I know people have concerns about the long-term viability of natural gas, but there are companies, I met with one today, for example, working on hydrogen hubs, the ability to transition natural gas resources to hydrogen. There are people working on carbon capture. I will be in Kentucky next week with EPRI looking at spending time learning more about low carbon initiatives that are underway. We are making a full court press to find and identify those things. But for now, we've got to move forward. We need a recommendation from you all on what we should do to deal with these issues right in front of our face. By 2028, we've got to have everything working. Yes, sir.
Well,
please.
we got three people ahead of you, and then we'll come to you, okay? There's more popping up here. So we've got a question from Christopher, then we've got Anne Marie, then we got Al, and then we got Femi, and we don't get a break. Let's go. All right, Christopher.
Can you hear me now?
Got you.
Hello?
We got you.
Okay, great. Great. Two things I want to share. One, I hope we'll put a little flag in our own mental process here as we move toward November or December and we come up with our recommendation process. In addition to whatever addenda and other documentation that we might be handing off to the Board of Trustees with our recommendation, I want us to think about, putting together a very, short, separate document about our bookends in our decision making and the thought process here, and in particular, what some of the major considerations might be that could dramatically alter, our recommendations, but are beyond our control. And I think we've already talked about page 11 and ERCOT. I think, our Board of Trustees are thoughtful and they do their own research, but I think it doesn't hurt for us to highlight for them that there are a few variables out there beyond our control that we just want them to keep in mind. And if a decision were to come down, say in 6 months, that dramatically alters the ERCOT market, at least we've flagged it so that they can add that to their decision-making process as well. And then one other thing, going back to the comments that we've heard from Councilwoman Villagrán and Dr. Femi, I'm not convinced we can make a no regrets decision, but without making this a yes/no hindsight, Monday morning quarterbacking process of say the spruce plants, I would suggest that we consider doing a very short order conversation with senior CPS staff who were involved in the planning and decision making, maybe at the very beginning of the STEP program and maybe back at Spruce, to get any feedback they might have, having been involved in that generation discussion and planning process, and what they have seen, develop and transpire over the last 10, 12 years. if there are any other avenues they might have pursued, had they had the benefit of hindsight as they were making their decisions back at that point. Clearly, the markets have changed. The economics of solar and gas and coal have all changed. So it's not apples to apples, but it might be worth trying to track down some of those folks and getting some of their insights on, the process of decision making per se, and whether there are any other elements they might have liked to have incorporated into their review process before pulling the trigger. And if that means putting together a small subcommittee of people from the RAC, I'm happy to be part of that. So, and that's all from me.
Thank you, Christopher. Okay, over to Anne Marie. Anne Marie, you had a comment? You texted.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So I had a comment on solar and 3 quick points, and that is, while certainly the residential program is important, I've had the opportunity to be a part of both an array on my roof and the community solar. And the community solar has a lot more viability. What happens with the roof program is those salesmen get out there, people sign up for solar, and if you watch on Nextdoor, there's a lot of people that are unhappy with the outcome, and that's because solar should be your last resort after you've buttoned up the envelope on your home with things like insulation, different windows if it's an older home. If you haven't done that and you add solar, you're not going to be happy. So that gets eliminated with the community solar, the solar farm panels, plus those panels are transferable. If you move, you take them with you. You take the benefit with you. You can even give that to another person or your church or whatever you want to do. And then third, I think it's important to remember that when these initiatives started with the solar programs, residential solar programs, really had to do with helping to build that market. And we may be past that point. The market may be built enough that just needs to be looked at. So those are the 3 comments I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we are working, looking at community solar options right now. So definitely on the radar.
Okay, Al, then Femi. Okay, Al's giving us back our break. Can I give a round of applause for Al? Okay, Femi.
That's a tough act to follow. I'm going to ask my question anyway. I'll keep it short, really. And I just want to respond to what Penny said about, what we have to do now. I have to give credit to 2 former CPS Energy staff members. Actually, I'm picking this concept from their presentation, and in my previous discussions with them, I have given them the necessary credit for what I'm about to say. January or February of 2019, I believe it was Chris Euxter and Frank Almaraz that gave a presentation that talked about what I now call hierarchy of decision making. They looked at things from a strategic to a day-to-day continuum. And frankly, I'd say that if we're looking at decisions we have to make with 25 years forward, the best we can do right now is to make what I call, kind of high level, low resolution decisions. And then as time goes by, yes, you start to make your operational decisions right down to the very hour before, or maybe even a few minutes before that electron goes out. That's how I saw that. And frankly, I had this discussion with Chris, and he didn't even think about it that way when he was making that presentation, but that's how I saw it. Now, my point is, if we're going to start making decisions in the next 5 years, then let's be frank with ourselves. Let's stop talking about technologies that are still on the drawing board. Those will not they would not even be available in the next 10 years, let's say. So, just so that whenever I hear these things about liquid air and all those other things. I just shut my ears, frankly, because it's not going to happen in the next 5 years that we have to make a decision. So let's cut those conversations and really focus on what needs to be done in the next 5 years. So with all due respect to Reed, please, can you help us cut those decisions short so we focus on what we can actually do in the next 5 years, please? Thank you.
So let me see what page that is, Femi. That's where we need to flesh this out. You're on track, but it's page. Oh, let's see. Let me get back here. So you go to page. That page is. It's got a bunch of numbers on it. It's little bitty print. So they're all little bitty print. It's the one that talks about all. It's got all. Okay, go to page 28. So if you look at 28, the way they've set up the portfolios is they've actually put in their dates as to when something will happen to each plant, okay? Now, if we feel like that in this decision-making, and I totally understand what you're talking about, that, you know, you're gonna have to make decisions now. We gotta look at our future curves, but this is telling you when we think things have to come down, when we think actions can be taken. And if you look at that, they're all pretty short term. And so as we start evaluating 1 through 9, we're going to have to keep in mind what actions, as you mentioned, that you're taking in the next 5 years, and this is all pretty much in the next 5 years, what actions we're taking in the next 5 years. If that doesn't get it, then we need to look at it a different way. But I understand totally what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. Break. Let's try to get back at 5 o'clock.
Hey, so just call to see how you doing. All right. So how things going? You have your meeting today already? That's good. What's you?
done, he's turned it on. Am I on? Okay, let's get back at it. We got a lot to do in this last hour. Hello. Hello. Back here. Come on. No, not quite. Come on. Come on, Peter. Michael. Who are we missing? Where's Dana? Yeah, we can't start without Dana. Where is he? Oh.
I'm here.
Okay, Dana's here. All right, let's get going. Now we're moving into the final two sections. This is going to be back to Charles River. We're going to do two things here. We're going to look at these market scenarios, which is going to address some of these concerns that people have about, are we really looking at the future properly? Well, we're looking at enough futures that maybe we can. And then we're going to talk about the portfolios, which is on that long sheet that I was talking to Femi about, that John's worked, as to how we're planning the activities on the individual plants for each plant portfolio. John, yours. Oh, and if there's questions on this, let's try to get through 8 and 9, and then we'll open it for questions. So let's try to have a smooth move through this so that everybody can see everything in these two sections. Then we'll open it to questions.
All right. Thanks, Reed. These next couple sections, you'll start to see a picture emerge, I hope, here as we drill down and see some of the issues that were raised, some really good points. You'll start to see where some of that might be captured and might be addressing some of the things that were raised. So I'll turn it over to Pat, and we'll step through it.
Okay, thank you, John. So yeah, back up here on slide 9, I think, if we advance. So we're going to start off with the scenarios. So this is a recap. We've had this slide, I think, the last 2 meetings, and just as a reminder here, and I think it's been said a few times today, again, the scenarios are intended to provide views on future external factors, future states of the world, independent of CPS Energy resource decisions. And the idea here is to reflect a wide, diverse, but plausible set of outcomes. And scenario development includes multiple linked and correlated key variables. And just as a final reminder, this is independent of the CPS Energy resource plans. So obviously different CPS Energy plans will look better or worse in different scenarios. But the idea here is, let's lay the framework for what the external market looks like, all the elements that impact the future cost to customer and future dispatch of different resources and the future surrounding market view, and then layer in the CPS Energy decisions and evaluate all of those portfolios against all the scenarios. So if we advance to the next slide, this is a recap of the 4 scenarios that we've been introducing on slide 10. We've got a reference scenario, a carbon-based economy scenario, a net zero carbon economy scenario, and a volatile market scenario. So again, we introduced these concepts back in July at a high level. In August, we fleshed them out a little bit, and we're going to do a quick recap of what all those key inputs look like. And then today, we're going to show some of the outputs from an ERCOT market perspective and try to tie this all together into these 4 integrated themes that hopefully, as John said, paint a picture for the environments that we're going to be looking at. So as a reminder, on the right-hand side, the natural gas prices, carbon policies, technology costs, demand growth, ERCOT market design, these are all sources of uncertainty that we can make forecasts about what they're going to look like. The forecasts are going to be wrong in some sense across the planning horizon, but the idea of developing these scenarios is, let's get a wide envelope of outcomes to stress test all of the portfolio options against. So that reference scenario is really a continuation of historical trends in demand and technological developments, base case view on commodity and fuel prices. And then the carbon-based economy and net zero carbon economy scenarios are very much 2 bookends around environmental regulation. Carbon-based economy has no federal or state level carbon limits or carbon prices, and as a result has lower commodity prices, particularly for natural gas, whereas the net zero carbon economy is based on stringent net zero type carbon targets that come through policy and manifest itself in a regulation. We're proxying that through a carbon price. And then finally, that volatile market scenario is something that we think is quite relevant in today's world, where we've got a high inflationary environment. Geopolitical concerns may drive policy decision-making, both on the economic front and the environmental regulation front. And that has cascading impacts on things such as fuel prices, and then supply chain issues on technology costs and so on. So if you go to the next slide, on slide 11, we flesh this out a little bit more. And this is a slide that we presented in August. Very slight modifications have been made just to clarify some things. But the idea here is that each of those 4 scenarios or states of the world are mapped to different outcomes for each of the key 5 demand, or I should say overall drivers on the top. That includes demand, natural gas prices, carbon policy, technology costs, and ERCOT design. So just very quickly, just to kind of flesh out what I said on the prior slide, that reference scenario has a set of baseline forecasts. And we talked about those last time. We'll do a real quick recap in a few minutes here. The carbon-based economy has lower natural gas prices due to production increases and less regulation on fossil fuel production. It has no carbon price, and it has higher demand as a result of low fuel and carbon prices. Lower energy prices that contribute to higher demand. On the flip side, the net zero carbon economy pushes carbon policy in the direction of stringent regulation, high carbon price, and it has several other corollary factors to that. I think Anita had a comment earlier in the day on electrification. And in this scenario, demand growth is high because we expect net zero carbon economy policies to push electrification of the transportation sector, the heating sector, parts of the industrial sector into electric. So you're going to see high demand growth. We also have some market design changes to preserve reserve margin and reliability across the year as we get demand changes. And then in response to that change in demand profile, we have a lot of demand coming out of the natural gas sector and driving prices low. So that's also a slightly lower gas price than the baseline. And then finally, as I said on the prior slide, the volatile market economy or volatile market scenario is based on a view that commodity prices stay high. We have high natural gas prices. We also have a slower than expected decline in technology costs because of inflation and supply chain concerns. And in response to that inflationary pressure, we have lower demand and no carbon price as a policy response. So as I think we said a couple meetings ago, you could develop scenarios that have lots of different permutations, but what we've tried to do is capture a reasonable set of correlated outcomes that have a wide range of potential drivers that influence the CPS Energy portfolio. So the next couple of slides, I'll go through very quickly. There's a lot of detail here, but we wanted to get everything out in the slides and out for discussion. I imagine the RAC may want to work with the peer review consultant to stress test their view on some of these inputs or ask questions, and certainly open to exchanging more data from the CRA and CPS Energy side. But we'll go through a couple slides on fuel prices and carbon policies and technology costs and demand as a recap. So if we go to slide 12, we'll start with the fuel price scenarios. So on the left-hand side, we have Henry Hub natural gas prices. As we note there, this excludes transportation costs. There are additional local delivery charges and transportation costs to get fuel to power plants. But at a macro hub level, this is the range of natural gas prices in real fixed dollars over time. Inflation impacts would be on top of this. And then over to the right, we have Powder River Basin coal price assumptions, a much tighter band, but again, excluding transportation. So this is the coal price at the mine. It has to get railed down to plants to the extent that the units are using Powder River Basin coal. So at a high level, the Henry Hub gas price assumptions range in today's dollars from about $2.50 to $6.50 or so over time. The upper end is very consistent with the level of pricing that we've seen through much of 2022, driven by high demand, export demand, geopolitical conflicts, maybe some discipline from producers in the sector. But the market forwards suggest that that will be short-lived. But in the volatile market scenario, we keep prices elevated. Whereas the lower end is consistent with levels that we saw just a couple of years ago. Demand was low at the outset of the COVID-19 crisis. Production was high, and it's possible that you could get that back to a position where prices were low. So again, the idea here is within these narratives to have a range of gas prices, and to earlier comments before, this will flow through the fuel costs for any facilities that are burning gas in the portfolio, and it will also impact the ERCOT market price. Let's jump to the next slide, which covers the carbon policy scenarios. So again, this is a recap. We've got a reference scenario in black that represents what we characterize as a moderate, middle-of-the-road view on potential carbon regulation. We see carbon regulation in different forms. It can be subsidies and tax credits, but there can also be penalties on emissions. And one way to proxy that is through a price on carbon. And the reference case starts at a relatively low level in 2027, 2028, and grows to about $25, $30 a ton, again, in real terms over the forecast horizon. Carbon-based economy has no price. The volatile market economy has no carbon price, but that net zero economy has a real run-up in the carbon price from 2026 onward, up close to $100 by the end of the 2030s, and up to about $140 and change by the out years of this study period. This is consistent with studies that CRA and others have done that estimate carbon prices exceeding $140 a ton are really needed to get to some of the global temperature increase limits that have been put out there through various international initiatives. So it's economy-wide, as I mentioned before. This type of price not only helps decarbonize the power sector, but also other sectors of the economy and the associated feedbacks. So again, a fairly wide envelope of ranges of carbon pressure that go across these different scenarios. If you go to the next slide, we'll hit on the technology costs. This is a quick overview of how we think about technology cost sources and the ranges of costs. And then we've got several slides which we'll go through quickly on what those ranges look like. We did present a similar slide last time in August to indicate that we've got currently available technology, and the discussion right before the break was very relevant here. In the near term, very focused on wind, solar, battery storage, paired solar and storage, and various natural gas technologies, whether they be combined cycle, reciprocating engines, or other gas turbine technologies. Longer term, there are new technologies that are relevant to getting the market right, or trying to get the market right. So although not a focus of CPS Energy's near-term decisions, when we simulate out 25 years, we want to have a view of potential other technologies, whether they be enhanced geothermal or small modular nuclear, long duration storage. And we've compiled sources largely in the public domain so that these can all be sourced and checked to get technology estimates for each of these categories. And then as you map these costs into the scenarios, the idea here is that we have a lot of uncertainty on what costs will look like 5, 10, 20 years down the line. So let's put a range of expectations around that. So in the net zero carbon economy scenario, for example, it's premised on faster decline, more improvement in enhanced technology costs, whereas volatile market has a slower decline. As I mentioned earlier, could be a result of higher than expected inflation for certain technology cost inputs, could be supply chain challenges that the industry is facing right now, could be very heavy demand that isn't able to be met by domestic supply that would put upward pressure on costs. So that's the framework with an overview of the sources. And then let's go to the next couple of slides to show at a high level what these costs look like. And as I said before, don't want to dwell on the details here in this setting, but we did want to publish and make all of this available for review and comment and follow-up details in terms of what the input technology costs look like and the range of costs that we're using, not only in this ERCOT market analysis, but also in the portfolio analysis. So here are the renewable and fossil plant scenarios, and to the earlier discussion, these are really the technologies that are available in the near term and likely to predominate in the ERCOT market. We've got onshore wind, standalone photovoltaic solar, solar with 4-hour lithium-ion battery, and 3 different fossil fuel natural gas resources, 4, I should say, that have combined cycle, a couple of different combustion turbine technologies, and reciprocating engines. So overall, you'll see a range of outcomes, particularly on the renewable and storage technologies. There's more uncertainty there as those technologies continue to mature, scale up, in terms of what type of learning curves will be achieved, what type of supply chain challenges will be occurring over time. And again, this is all in real dollars, fixed dollars to today's dollars. These are what the costs look like. So for example, standalone solar, we expect cost declines across all scenarios by the time you get out into the late 2040s, but the trajectories could be very different. And the costs, not only for this ERCOT market analysis, but for the CPS portfolio, are going to be dependent on that range of technologies that we look at. If we go to the next slide, we have a set of additional technologies focused on storage and geothermal. So lithium-ion batteries are a predominant storage technology right now, but the duration of those storage technologies can impact its costs. So duration means the amount of energy that the battery can hold and ultimately output over time based on its megawatt rating. So a 4-hour battery at 100 megawatts is able to produce 400 megawatts of charge or discharge over time, whereas an 8-hour battery would have 800 megawatt hours at that same capacity. So longer duration is more expensive. It also has additional attributes in the market. But again, we want to get a range on a dollar per kilowatt basis installed for what these different technology types look like. On the geothermal side, this is enhanced geothermal technology. So again, not a near-term option, but as we look long-term in the ERCOT market, what could come in? What if there are technology breakthroughs? You could see that we have significant declines on the net zero economy to have a technology cost that is competitive with many other resources. And I should have premised this whole section by saying, everything here is on a dollar per kilowatt basis. Not every technology operates the same. So while this is the installed technology per kilowatt, you're going to have different kilowatt hours generated by different resource types, depending on their natural availability, such as wind and solar, depending on their expected dispatch in the ERCOT market, based on their fuel costs and their efficiency. So this is really one input metric, and you can't necessarily make an apples to apples comparison. But again, we want to get a sense, or give the audience here a sense of the range of costs that we're looking at. If we go to the next slide, longer duration storage, very quickly, these are a couple of other technologies that could be longer term: compressed air, flow batteries, pump thermal. We've heard some comments from the group on making sure that we're at least looking at longer duration storage options long term and keeping them in the portfolio of options. And here's a range. Don't want to dwell on this again because it's not a near-term technology, but as we build up options for the ERCOT market, we thought it's important to publicize that. And then finally, the last 2 technologies we have are hydrogen and small modular reactors. So if you go to the next slide, 18, there, we've got a view on what the cost premium for a hydrogen combustion turbine is, and the range of potential costs for nuclear small modular reactors. So hydrogen technology is emerging. There's 2 components to it. One, the turbine or engine in which you burn the hydrogen, and then secondly, how you produce it. This is only the former, but there are other accounting measures as we go forward into the portfolio analysis to also consider the production of hydrogen and the associated tax credits that will now be available for that. And then small modular reactors, this is a longer term, 2030 and beyond type resource option, but again, want to show the range of costs that we're looking at. So I know that was a very quick rundown, and if there are questions at a later point, obviously we welcome any of them and are willing to share this data with the RAC members or the peer consultant as we move forward. So I think that closes out the technology cost section, and let's go to the next slide, which tries to point out how this all comes together in the ERCOT market. So we've talked about all the inputs, and ultimately what we do is simulate the ERCOT-wide system to take a look at how it might operate when you feed the market these gas prices or these technology costs or these carbon policies or these load growth trajectories to ultimately get a set of outputs that are shown in the middle of this slide. So what the ERCOT market capacity mix might look like, what the ERCOT generation mix might look like. So capacity versus generation, two different things. How much capacity is installed versus how many megawatt hours or how much energy is being produced by that capacity. And then how the emission profile and ultimately the prices within the ERCOT market are likely to evolve. So as a reminder, this is the external environment. You see that little illustration here on the slide, just graphically intended to show CPS is a small part of ERCOT, about 7% of total load and capacity, different ways you can look at it. But we're trying to simulate the surrounding market and then take a deeper dive at how CPS operates in that. So this next set of slides are going to be focused really on that surrounding market so that we can evaluate each portfolio within that surrounding market framework. So if you go to the next slide, we'll give a view of how that capacity mix is projected to evolve across these different scenarios. So we'll start in 2030 and then go to 2040. So on this graphic, what we're showing in stacked bar is the makeup of the entire ERCOT market by different fuel types in the present day, 2022, that left-hand bar, and then what the makeup might look like as you feed the model simulation, all these different inputs we talked about in the year 2030. And without getting into too much detail here, you can see similarities across the board, but a little bit of divergence developing. The tops of the bars, the height of the bars are all a little different because we have different demand growth expectations, as you'll recall from the input assumptions. The mix of the bars are all a little bit different. The portfolios that have either higher fuel and carbon prices or better incentives for renewable technologies or lower renewable technology costs are going to have a little bit more wind and solar than the portfolio or the scenario options that have no carbon prices or have lower fuel costs because there's a trade-off between gas prices and coal prices and renewable costs. If you go to the next slide, I think it's more interesting in 2040 when you look at 20 years down the line. Here's what the ERCOT market, how it might evolve. And if CPS Energy is considering different portfolio strategies, this is the environment that you could be operating in. And how will your different plants and resources perform if there's more or less gas or renewables or other storage resources in the market? So we see quite a bit more divergence. For example, the net zero economy portfolio has the most load that has to be met due to that electrification push and the most clean energy. It has quite a bit of wind and solar and storage and even some geothermal technology that would be clean. Whereas the carbon-based economy, the CBE scenario there, has more gas, which is a result of having lower gas prices for longer, no carbon policy. And although we expect wind and solar and storage to grow across the board, not as fast in that particular scenario. And then if we move to the next slide, we translate this capacity view into a generation view. So again, the capacity is how much capacity is installed in the market. Generation is how many energy megawatt hours or terawatt hours in the case of this graphic are being produced and delivered to the grid. And you see quite a lot of differentiation developing again here. So again, the left-hand bar is the present day. You can see a fairly diverse mix in ERCOT, nuclear at the bottom, coal in gray, gas in blue. and then a fair amount of wind and a growing share of solar in green and orange respectively. And then moving out into time in each of these 4 scenarios, you can see how the market is evolving differently. And again, the main points to look at are how much coal and gas is staying in the market relative to how much. So again, the bookend scenarios are very much the CBE and the NZE. You could see by 2040, we have quite a lot of gas and a little bit of coal still sticking around in the CBE scenario, whereas the NZE scenario is dominated by renewables, wind, solar, geothermal. And that's going to have an impact on how the market evolves, what the prices in the ERCOT market will be, and how potential CPS energy resources fit within that market. So again, lots of detail here. Happy to do any follow-up on the data, but we wanted to lay out at a high level what the concepts look like, what the implications are, and then we've got a couple more slides, if you go to the next slide, on some of the key outputs for what the ERCOT market as a whole looks like. This is CO2 emissions. So across each of these 4 scenarios, these are different trajectories for how the CO2 emission profile throughout ERCOT might look. And we've got quite a range of outcomes developing. The NZE scenario is a net zero type concept, as we talked about, and it gets to very close to 0 CO2 emissions across ERCOT. There's a little bit of gas still generating, but overall, from an economy-wide perspective, you have very few emissions of CO2 in that scenario. And then stepping up, you've got a range of different outcomes for the reference case, VMA, and then the highest set of emissions comes from the CBE, or the carbon-based economy. This is relevant to the extent that we're accounting for market purchases or sales and what the emissions profile might look like for CPS Energy. If you go to the next slide, we focus on the power prices and how they might look like. And you can see a lot of movement around over time in each of these scenarios. And the final slide, as we get to it in a minute here, will show a more granular view. But the key drivers here are: what are the variable costs of production in the ERCOT market, fuel prices, emission prices, and what are the type of units that are setting the market price at ERCOT? So as most of you are presumably aware, the ERCOT market is a competitive market. Each resource offers in a bid for how much it costs them to operate on a variable basis, and that's stacked up against the demand every hour. And the marginal unit sets the price. And depending on the variable cost of that marginal unit, and frankly, the overall definition of that marginal unit, you're going to have a range of power price outcomes. So the idea here is that we have different outcomes as a result of different gas prices. You can see the CBE scenario falling faster than the others, particularly VMA, because the gas price is lower. Over time, as you get more and more renewables in the market, you actually, on average, are going to lower the power price. So although the NZE scenario has a high carbon price, it's offset by lots of new renewable technology. So the range of price outcomes here are going to dictate how CPS Energy options are going to perform, how they will dispatch, and what type of market purchases and sales, to the earlier discussion, contribute to the overall portfolio costs. And then finally, on the next slide, just to dive a little bit deeper, there's hourly granularity. So there's a lot of data that comes with these simulations. We're looking across 25 years and trying to simulate what that market looks like every hour. And you can look at the average for a nice snapshot, but when you dive a little bit deeper, the shape of the price curves over a representative day are going to look quite a bit different. And again, this is going to impact the performance and the behavior of resources in the potential CPS Energy fleet. So just for example here, the NZE net zero economy scenario here, you can see very low prices in this particular sample out in 2040 for much of the day. There's a lot of renewable energy, wind and solar, throughout much of the day that keeps that variable cost of energy low. But in the evening time, particularly as the solar is going down, there's still the need to ramp up and respond to the demand that exists in the system. And for just a couple hours in the day, you could have very high prices because a natural gas plant may have had to turn on just for a couple of hours, for example. even though the system is still dominated by renewables. So that hourly shape is something that, again, impacts the market that CPS Energy operates within, and we want to have a range of potential outcomes against which to evaluate the portfolios. And this is just one sample to show this illustratively, but all this data is going to be underlying the simulations that will eventually run for CPS Energy. So I think that closes this section. John, we can either run through the portfolios or pause here briefly for any comments.
What do you want to do, Reed?
Okay, we can stop here, and we'll just talk about the portfolios. So that goes to some of what Femi was talking about and how they're designed. All right, let's. If anyone has questions on this section, let's have them. Online? Okay, I got a couple on the technology costs. Those are interesting numbers. However, I assume it doesn't tell me what that vertical axis is there, but I assume that's the installation cost by kilowatt hour, not the cost of generation by kilowatt hour. It's not on there. It's not labeled, but I'm assuming that's what it is. If I'm wrong, correct me. Yeah, install cost. It doesn't say that, but let's just assume that is. It doesn't say. I mean, it is. Well, then what I'm saying, yeah, but it's dollar, but it doesn't say it's install cost. So I'm assuming it's install cost. And I guess what I'm saying is what we really need, since we're buying most of our incremental power in the future, we probably ought to look at these on a cost basis for the power, as opposed, it might mean more. It might mean more for people to understand that if they're getting power from a 20-hour flow battery, it's so many dollars per kilowatt hour or megawatt hour, as opposed to installing a capacity, which is hard for people to go all the way through the plant, the cost and all of that. Just another way of maybe letting people look at it. On page 13, that was on 15 to 18. Page 13, the baseline carbon price. I'm concerned that in our reference case, we do use $20, and the Democrats have just passed a bill that doesn't seem to be on the penalty side. It seems to be on the reward side. So I'm not sure that for our reference case, $20 is, or it gets over $20 to 30-something dollars. I think this is a pretty important, pretty pivotal bill, and there's nothing in that would actually cost it. They went from the stick to the carrot side, so I'd like for that to be relooked at. Also in the market, when you talk about confirmed changes, one of the things that I didn't see in those four, and I'm sorry I didn't put the page number down, but in the middle of the page where you had those four things, which is market capacity, generation mix, one of the things that's going to be very important to us is the amount of firm reserves over the peak demand. And that goes to the whole issue of whether we're going to ever reestablish a capacity market versus an energy-only market. And I don't see that. I don't see that look in here. If I'm wrong, just correct me. But that's going to be important to us because that's the whole issue from '99 is we've gone to this energy-only market. You know, some of us that are still running these old plants are providing the firm capacity. Also on page 20. Okay, this is when we're talking the reference case. What I'm concerned about here is if you look at the reference case, it's saying that the increased solar and wind displaces coal and gas, and the additional capacity storage capacity supports intermittency in this earlier period as opposed to dispatchable natural gas. But then in the later one, it does say gas remains to balance. So I think we need to reconcile that if we can. And on 22, I wonder, I assume, one of the big questions is, as we get out there, if you look at the percent of dispatchable, let's see, let's go to, 22. If you look at, you get out there in 2030, on some of these cases, including the reference case, you've got, say, 300, almost 300 to 370 of intermittency, and you've only got 159, and at 2040, and but it's better in 2030. And I guess just as we make that move through there, is that enough to offset the intermittency? I think that's just something that, and that has to go back to reliability. I don't know, that's my comments. Okay, let's bring it back up. Anybody else got anything? Okay, let's take Dana first, and then we'll do Peter.
Hi, I'm looking at page 12 in your Henry Hub gas price assumptions. I don't know how you get to that, because you have to make some pretty wild assumptions, some changes that have to happen from the reality of what's happening now in the world. And I'd like to hear what makes you think that those are even close to being right.
Yeah, well, I think part of the reason for doing scenarios is to get a broad envelope of outcomes, because we know there's going to be a lot of volatility, and any single forecast is certainly going to be wrong over the long term. The market forwards are currently falling to about $3 to $4 over the next 3 years. So that's the reason for the decline. And then beyond that, a series of uncertainties, to your point, are likely to drive prices in any different direction. So I think the key drivers that go into that are: what are the production costs? What are the regulations on the natural gas sector? What's the demand for natural gas? What's the export demand? And that all kind of goes into this range. The range is reliant on the AEO, the Energy Information Administration's range of scenarios. So they have a whole series of supply and demand factors that go into that. But certainly agree that it's very difficult to claim that any single forecast is going to be right, because we know the volatility in the natural gas market will persist. So the idea here is, let's get a good envelope of outcomes to stress test all the portfolios against.
That's not a very good answer, because if you look at what's going on in Europe today, the price of natural gas delivered in Europe is like $25 or $30. And I don't see how you possibly can get there by 2025, 26 with a $2 or $3 number. That's just impossible. And I think it's silly to make those kind of assumptions and build it into these scenarios. I mean, it's just way off reality.
No, it's a good comment. I mean, the market forwards in the U.S. are tracing the black line very closely right now. There are constraints, obviously, to get gas from the U.S. to Europe, so they're very different markets. But I hear your point on the high end, and the demand for natural gas and potential LNG export increases could push things up. The volatile market scenario is intended to proxy that. If there's a view that should go even higher, we could take that into account. But we're trying to capture the domestic market, and there's a lot of market signals in the near term that suggest this pricing range, and then long term, a lot of uncertainty about how the upside and the downside might look.
I beg to differ. I don't see any scenarios that have this kind of estimation for price. None. I mean, I like to see where you're getting them.
Okay. Yeah, this is from the EIA. We could share that detail for sure.
EIA is notoriously wrong on their pricing. All right, I don't want to belabor the point, but this is not a very realistic scenario that you're building here, and then you're building these models on. I mean, the assumptions. I think you ought to build another scenario. Let's see what that looks like, using kind of what's going on now and what might happen.
Well, Dana, I understand what you're saying on the gas business, and to some extent, we're going to get a look at a higher gas price with the volatile market case scenario. And so that is going to be up in the $6 and $5 range. I mean, maybe that's not enough, and maybe that orange line needs to be adjusted.
No, I could go along with the orange line.
Well, you're going to get to go along with that because every one of these portfolios will be evaluated against the orange line. Okay? All right, I think it was Peter and then Al. Peter?
Peter Onofre. First, a couple of items. Thank you, Dana, for providing that report. I think we can't separate our policies from our politics, so we have to consider what's going to be coming down the pike. And of course, with the pricing here and the ERCOT, I think, kind of to your point, Dana, that we're operating right now in a net zero economy, which is why we have a volatile economy. So that fourth scenario is why we are where we are, and it just depending on if we stay in that, whether those prices are going to go up or down for the natural gas. I think that's the part of the decision-making process. And the dispatchability value of it, I think, is going to be at a premium. So that's got to be factored in as well. So Reed, I just want to say ditto to all your points that you made about identifying those items. Thank you for doing that homework. That was, I think, ideal to be able to really draw down into how we get to those benchmarks in these scenarios. So those are my comments. Just wanted to share those thoughts.
Peter, back to your point, I think today we probably are more in the volatile market than we are in the reference market. Okay, if you look at the war and everything else, we're in the volatile market.
And I think when we got there because of the geopolitical that you're referencing, but also because of the net zero economy that we're driving in, because of the policies that we've created here recently. I know we're moving toward green, and that's really fed into my opinion, but that's my opinion on that.
Okay.
But I agree with you.
But
We are in a
again,
volatile market.
Let's be clear. We'll have plenty of time to talk to Burns and McDonnell about what they think and how they view these and what the sources are. So those are going to be important questions that we can ask them at the appropriate time, and that's something we should do. And remember, at part of the time we might be on, unfortunately, we might be on the orange line. Part of the time we might be on the black line. So, it can bounce around, and that's why we have to look at all these different data points. Okay, now who's next in here, and then we'll go online. Okay, Femi, you got your mic.
Yeah, I'm gonna, let's see, try and make this, I don't know how to ask this question, but I, in some ways, subscribe to Dana's view that our questions have not been very well adequately answered. But I'm giving us a chance to at least have those conversations with the with the peer review consultant, and hopefully with time this will get clarified quickly enough, because we also have a deadline working towards a December timeline. But I guess the way I want to start this is to, first of all, humbly and very humbly disagree with the councilwoman. We cannot separate policy from what we're doing now, because it sets the context, the premise for the strategic decisions that CPS Energy will be making within the ERCOT context. So to me, it's just very difficult to remove politics, because that's the environment in which negotiations are made to set the policies that essentially determine what this market framework would look like. So going back to the CPAC, I guess that's what it's called, the CPAC report, which again, Dana thinks it's really very helpful. And I'm mindful of the fact that this was also a political committee. Let's be frank about it. We would expect certain recommendations to have come from this committee. So, but I want to leave with, I want to just stress the positive first. They talked about three things. And if you search for these three words in exactly the same order with the commas, reliable, stable, and affordable, those are three of the objectives that we have been talking about all day at the beginning. So it goes to show that there is some consistency, there's some alignment with what we're doing here and what's going on at the state level. So that's one positive that I'm taking out of this report. But the other thing I also want us to think about is the fact that somewhere on, if we go through the executive summary of this report, it says, and I'll just read it because it's three short sentences or three lines. Renewable resources do not contribute inertia to the grid. And there's the definition of what inertia means. And it goes on to say that the more that power systems rely on wind, solar, and battery storage systems, the greater the risk that a major grid disturbance will cause the grid to cascade into a blackout condition. I'm sorry, we all live here in February of 2021. It's not so much as described here or for these reasons, but we know what a major grid disturbance looks like. So when we come back to talk about stress test, as I believe Pat has said in his presentation, I would like to see either CRA or with input from us and Burns and McDonnell design a specific stress test that will place whatever plan comes out, P1 to P8 or 9, in the context of what happened in 2021, February, recognizing the state of what happened in ERCOT, what PUC was doing, plus what was within the control of CPS Energy. I want to see that scenario designed and maybe explained to the community, because if I were, one way to gain instant credibility with the San Antonio community will be to put that exact scenario and test it and say, our system survived for these and these reasons. Everything we're doing makes sense. It's following the normal planning process. But the people out there, our community, understand what they went through in February 2021. And they will judge the outcome of this by the ability to withstand such a situation. If we cannot design that scenario and test it and stress test it, I'm sorry, we may have failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Femi. Okay, it's everybody in here online, Ann? Okay, we're gonna go into.
I have a comment. This is an Aqua. And it's regarding Femi's comments specifically around wind and solar being a reason for grid failure. In a scenario that just happened during our extreme heat wave, it was energy conservation, wind and solar that saved the grid from failure. And so I think that's important to bring in as well, specifically around conservation and weatherization for everyone.
Okay, thank you.
And
Yeah, now who's somebody? Are they?
hi, Reed. Yes, I'm sorry. It's Anita. I
Oh,
also
okay.
had a quick comment.
Yeah, Ann just didn't know. I'm sorry, I didn't know to recognize.
That's okay. I think I was talking, I was on mute. I'm so sorry. You know, this kind of just goes back to this, you know, the State Energy Plan Advisory Committee report and kind of more understanding because, you know, the future of ERCOT drives a lot of our what we will be able to do or not what we'll be able to do, but how we're going to maximize our opportunities. So, you know, I kind of wanted to bring that up because, you know, I think a lot of and I agree like with you know, what Femi is saying about like testing it against Winter Storm Uri, but you know, as you know, Reed, because you led that effort, that's like a multi-layered sequence of things that happen, a lot of them on also on the state level. So then it kind of goes back to, well, if you look at what they're planning now and the result of this Senate Bill 3, a lot of, it's kind of like, well, it's going to change that scenario somewhat just to abbreviate it, right? In terms of like things that they're going to be requiring because of Winter Storm Uri. The other part of that, and again, I don't have a total grasp on, but want to bring up so that we can unpack it or explain it, will be this. They have some ideas about restructuring really the gas market in Texas. And again, and I wanted to like a little bit more understand, even if it's not like right now, but in the future, more understand the impact of the state energy plan on our scenarios. If I'm trying to say that in a condensed way.
Anita, let's try to get together with a meeting with Kathy and go over that, because that's one of the reasons I wanted to put another metric in there, and that is the reliability. We're losing the capacity market because the plants that are providing the capacity market, the reliability, the quick start, they're going away. They're aging out. So it's either ERCOT's going to shift back some way to some part of it as a capacity market, or they're going to stay on an energy only market, because they're again politics, free market. So we're going to have to see where we think it's going to go, and it is going to make a big difference. There's no doubt. Yes, Dee Dee.
Sorry.
Sorry. In listening to Dana's concerns and questions about gas and FEMI, also, Mike, y'all had all these questions that are coming up. My concern right now is that, we're on a very tight schedule to come up with a recommendation or a vote. Like, I hope we're not going to be rushed through this. Like, I feel like we were rushed through a lot of the rate conversations. We were definitely, like, based on feedback from everybody who when we're voting, that we rushed through the whole step conversations. That what if we still have more questions and want to question the data that comes from all of this, and December is just like right around the corner. So what do we do when, when we just, I think, have two meetings with Burns and McDonnell after this? And I know we can probably email questions too, but really the best way to ask questions and learn from each other is to be here in a room. So I'm just super concerned that this is being rushed, like a lot of things that have happened in this RAC.
I totally share your concern. Thank you. Okay, anything else here? Anything else there?
Yes, I have one final comment.
Who is this?
Anita.
Oh, Anita, okay.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to, listen, that this report, that Dana sent out, that I've been referencing, the State Energy Plan Advisory Committee report, that just came out on the 1st of September. And, I can say for myself, I don't know who else, it was not necessarily on my radar that that's when it was coming out, or, we knew some things were brewing over there, but I was not aware of that. So, I do think it's such a pivotal thing. I will say this is, it's a very challenging time, but, this is our opportunity to, instead of playing defense, to look at what, to more fully understand our potential and start playing a little bit more long-term offense, because once we understand a little bit better also what's going to happen within the ERCOT market based on these major changes that are coming down, like even something simple as mapping out the critical assets. They didn't have that map before, and that will have a financial impact, and it will have an impact on just the market in various ways, and that will subsequently impact how we're going to play our game, if that makes sense. So, my final comment is just to say, I'd love to talk to you guys offline. I want to better understand it, but I do think that we should maybe at the next RAC, have some kind of summation about, like, hey, this is kind of the general direction that things are going, and this is going to be the impact of those changes in terms of generation and also the market. Thank you.
Thank you. Did I see another hand? Michael, and then Dana, and then we'll go on to the last section.
Yeah, just a real quick comment to follow up on Femi, and it's not really a question. And that is, I agree that we need to look at these extremes because what you read, Femi, that talked about the grid cascading into a blackout situation, that's not what we had. We didn't have anywhere close to that in Uri. We thought that was bad. We had rolling blackouts that was more managed. A grid blackout could take weeks to bring generation back on and get the everything synced up and the oscillations of the electricity back on. So what this is talking about, if we ever had that real extreme with a true grid blackout, that's going to be could be much worse than what we just saw. So just to clarify what this means.
Okay. Okay, thanks. We were just trying to get some data here. Next, Dana?
Well, I just wanted to have one quick comment. I didn't think I would ever agree with Dee Dee on anything. But her comments are good. I think we should have more discussion and answers about this thing because there's still a lot of things that, when we get all this information, and a lot of it, I don't agree with. And the methodology, I agree with Femi on this part. We don't really get our questions answered. And if we could go around and around the discussions internally here, I think it'd be a big help without a deadline. And maybe is that imposed by the?
Well, that's the deadline that we've been given. That's the deadline the board wants to consider it. As far as going around, you're right, Dana. That's what we're trying to set these two meetings up for on those 2 days where we've got morning and afternoon sessions. Those are designed just to do that, okay?
Okay.
I don't know if that's enough, but that's what I try to put them in there for. All right. Going once, going twice. Go, John.
All right, we're going to move to the portfolio descriptions. There's really 2 slides here, so let's hang in there and have Pat step us through those and see if there's any comments, questions.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So maybe we go ahead to slide 27 and just as another final reminder on scenarios versus portfolios. So we just stepped through the future states of the world, which are the scenarios, and now the portfolios are really focused on the CPS energy plans to meet customer requirements in the future. And these are combinations of decisions taken by CPS Energy to add new capacity, to retire existing capacity, to implement demand side management programs. And if we go to the next slide, we'll lay out the 9 concepts that we're working under. So back in the August meeting, you'll probably recall that we introduced this topic. So slide 28, if we can move to that, has the overview of the 9 different concepts that are now being built out for further evaluation. Back in August, we provided a real high level of what the retirement dates and the different concepts looked like in aggregate. We had a couple of graphics and tables. But this is everything fleshed out in more detail. And I'll just walk through these kind of one at a time to give a sense of what the differentiations and distinctions are. And then we just have one more slide that gives you a pathway forward for the analysis. So the column headings P1 to P9, that just stands for Portfolio 1 to Portfolio 9. And then the rows at the top in blue are showing the allowed technology or the types of technology that we will be focused on to meet future capacity gaps that are associated with plant retirements, but also associated with natural load growth over time in the CPS Energy system. And then the remaining rows there represent existing fleet resources and the associated retirement dates that are varying across these portfolios. So the idea here is to develop 9 distinct options, and we've got our different sensitivities, which will be looked at in addition to this, And the 9 distinct options have different permutations of existing fleet operations and new resource types. So P1 and P2 are different iterations on a single theme of existing fleet retirement dates. So this would have Spruce 1 retiring at the end of 2028. Spruce 2 would convert to natural gas at the end of 2027 and continue to operate through the long time horizon. And then the various other gas plants, including the combined cycles and steam and peaking units in the portfolio, would retire over time. There are a few units in the near term that are really going to drive these near-term decisions, and then you can see the bottom 4 or so are more longer term. Now, within that retirement schedule, we have Portfolio 1, which is going to be focused on a gas-only replacement. So gas technologies would replace any new capacity needs over time. And Portfolio 2 is a blend concept where we will look at the economic blend of different gas and renewable and storage technologies to meet that mix. So the economic mix comes from a simulation model of the CPS portfolio within the ERCOT market that we just talked about. We're going to focus on the reference case to develop those technology mixes. Portfolio 3 is a little bit of a different spin on that concept with early retirement of both Spruce units. So by the end of 2028, both Spruce units would retire and everything would be filled with renewables. This is in some sense a bookend, although as we get to some of the other portfolios that have been proposed, there are some even earlier dates. But instead of looking at a staged retirement and a conversion, this would retire the Spruce unit in full and replace completely with renewables. And then Portfolio 4 is somewhat of the opposite to that concept, where you retain the coal units for a long period. You can see Spruce 1 in the 2040s, Spruce 2 in the 2060s, and again, replace the capacity with a blend of resources. So we think those first 4 portfolios have a mix of coal retirement, conversion dates at various points in time, and different replacement resources across the gamut from all gas, all renewables, and a blend in between. And then portfolios 5 to 9 have been requested. We referenced this before and did have some feedback from RAC member Belmaris, and have those portfolios documented here with different retirement dates, primarily for Spruce 1 and Spruce 2, but also P6 and P7. You'll see more accelerated retirement dates for the gas units that are currently in the fleet, and then a mix of only renewable technology that would replace the capacity needs. So again, these are permutations on the retirement dates for the coal capacity, ranging from anywhere between 2025 and 2028, including P8 and P9, which convert to gas in 2025 and retire a decade later. And then different options for the gas capacity. P5, 8, and 9 match the P1 to P4 gas retirements, and P6 to P7, as I said, have a more accelerated range of retirements. So just to tie this all together, these are CPS Energy portfolios. These are the retirement dates for the existing fleet. And then as we build these out in the analysis, what's going to happen is there will be additions to the portfolio, either gas only, renewables only, or different blends that will come into the mix over time. And as we've been talking about, we're going to be very heavily focused on the near term. But to run these portfolios, you will see over time additions of different resource types throughout the entire 25-year time horizon. Couple footnotes on the bottom, just go through them quickly, that obviously to implement these type of plans, unit retirements do require ERCOT approval, and there could be regional transmission upgrades that are required. So there could be a need to bridge any capacity gaps with market purchases that we will consider as we evaluate these resources and these resource portfolio mixes. But we are going to stick to these retirement dates as they've been outlined. And then finally, to tie it up, if we go to the next slide, just to give you a visual for how this will look going forward. Again, there's a lot of underlying data and portfolio concept development that will be shared. But at a high level, we've got these 9 portfolios, and we're going to evaluate them against all 4 scenarios, plus the extreme weather sensitivity that we've been talking about. And we're ultimately going to have results for each of those permutations. On the scorecard, we're going to try to summarize things, and we'll start with the reference scenario. So for the October meeting, the focus is really going to be on how do each of these 9 concepts, what do they look like in detail, and how do they perform against our metrics within the reference case. And then going forward, you will see results against each of the 3 other scenarios we talked about. That extreme weather condition, which I think the comments today are consistent with what we're thinking. Look at a 2021 winter type scenario, look at a very hot summer type scenario, as well as those sensitivities largely around the STEP demand side management programs. So these will be different ways of looking at the different portfolios. Hopefully, the staging of the analysis will allow us to provide a reference view and then supplement it with the scenarios. But ultimately, the idea here is now to combine all this upfront work and have the permutations out there for portfolios by scenarios and use that in the decision-making tool. So I'll stop there, John. If you've got anything else to add, please do, or open the floor.
Pat, I don't have anything else, and I'll turn it over to Reed for comments.
Anyone? Anyone? Tired? It's 8 minutes after 6. Hungry? Anybody online? We're adjourned. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Al, did you have your hand up? I missed you. No, I missed you. Don't start that.
Thanks, everybody.
If we stick with renewals, are we going to become like are we going to have to be counting on rolling blackouts because?
It'll clearly mean that we have to buy more power on the grid, perhaps. I don't know. Well, let's just see the models. I don't know yet. I can't.
And then because,
One.
okay, and because solar, we have to overbuild in order to get
Yeah.
what we want.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of geography. Back to
Yeah.
Michael Sanchez's comment a couple of meetings ago. How much land is that going to take, and what is that taxable income that the city and county loses?
Well, actually, you put them in, and then the counties that you put them in actually get some pretty good tax numbers. It helps school districts, but that's another.
Does it?
That's a subject for another day.
Okay, then I withdraw that question.
Okay. All right. Anything else?
Thank you, Reed.
Thank y'all so much for your patience and time getting through that. Remember, we got the Burns and McDonald folks on this site, and they're available. Hey, Jim, and seeing you.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.